want to welcome you to this important event on land and the peace agenda in Colombia. U.S. Institute of Peace is pleased to be able to host this event, which we're co-sponsoring with the U.S. Office on Colombia. My name is David Smock. I'm a Senior Vice President here at USIP in charge of the Centers of Innovation. Through research, public programming, grants, and courses at our academy, USIP has grappled with the complex relationship of land, development, displacement, and peace. Two contributions dealing with this theme that merit special attention are a USIP publication on integrating internal displacement into peace processes and agreements, and a course we offer through our academy on land, conflict, and property. The course will be offered the first week of June and is designed to provide policymakers and practitioners with analytic tools for assessing and addressing an array of complex land and property disputes. Peace practitioners and development specialists agree on the potential role of broad-based rural development and land reform as stabilizing elements for polarized or conflicted societies. Implementation of such reforms is not straightforward, and the gap between theory and practice is often huge. Conferences such as this one that bring together scholars, policymakers, and development specialists can assist in narrowing this gap between theory and practice. USIP's work on Colombia, carried out under the leadership of Jenny Bouvier, has supported civil society efforts to prevent violence and to bring the internal armed conflict to an end. Today, the Colombian government and the FARC are engaged in a cycle of talks in Havana that may lead to a new chapter in Colombian history. We hope that today's event can improve policy implementation and ensure that the long-standing structural issues at the roots of Colombian conflict are addressed in an effective way that leads to sustainable peace in Colombia. Thank you for coming, and I hope this will turn out to be a productive conference. And now I would like to welcome Dana Brown, who is Director of the U.S. Office on Colombia.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As was said, my name is Dana Brown, and I'm the director of the U.S. Office on Colombia, one of the organizations responsible for today's event. We are very pleased to see so many people interested in the topics that we've proposed for discussion today. For those of you who don't know our work, the U.S. Office on Colombia is an education and advocacy organization that promotes human rights, an end to impunity, and a lasting peace in Colombia. We've been working on issues of land rights and protection for land rights activists and returning communities for many years. In fact, we had the pleasure of organizing a conference similar to this in 2010, along with the U.N. Institute for Peace and the Inter-American Foundation. And as soon as the Victims' Law was passed, we knew it was time to have a similar event and a forum for exchanging ideas and proposals around these critical issues. Then, of course, as the peace process became public and we learned that agrarian development would be the first point on the agenda, we became even more excited to bring this forum to Washington, D.C. at this critical time. We think you'll agree that the issues of land rights, reform, and restitution are more relevant than ever to the prospects for peace in Colombia. We are thrilled to be joined by such a distinguished panel of guests today and by a distinguished audience. I'll let Jenny enumerate the long list of people and organizations without whom today would not be possible. But lastly, I wanted to mention that the interest we're seeing here today in this room about the Colombia peace process is echoing that of interest that we're seeing on the Hill currently, where a Dear Colleague letter is being circulated in Congress supporting the Colombian peace process and the rights of victims. We're pleased to be joined today by some of the congressional staffers responsible for that effort, and we know that they would love to speak with you about how you can lend your support as well. Again, thank you all for joining us, and please take a time to look at the literature table outside where you can get information about many of the topics being discussed today. Thank you. Now I hand it over to Jenny.
Good afternoon. My name is Ginny Bouvier. I'm Senior Program Officer for Latin America here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We are thrilled to have you all here. We had to move from a small room. It looks like we're not packed, but we overflowed 2 other rooms in order to get the auditorium, so I'm delighted that we were able to move here. We're broadcasting this event live at the USIP website, where it will be archived and available for future reference. So I'd like to just say a word of welcome to all our webcast viewers. I know we also have a number of Twitterers in the audience, and I encourage the Twitterers to use the hashtag #PazColombia to be able to identify other people who are twittering about the event. Y quiero decir algunas palabras de bienvenido a los.
I would like to also say some welcome words for those that speak in Spanish. Most of the speakers will be presenting in Spanish, and some of them will be presenting in English. We will have interpretation services in both languages.
In Spanish, and we're pleased to have 2 highly capable interpreters, Kathy Ogle and Isiar Gomez, to provide translation throughout the day. Headsets are available at the auditorium entrance if you've not found them already, and I would advise that even if you're a good Spanish speaker, you may want to have a headset available, because some of the discussion may get a little bit technical and the translation issues get very complicated. We have been blessed with an amazing lineup of speakers. We're grateful to them for taking the time and trouble to travel from their homes in Colombia to share their experiences and their expertise with us, and we look forward to learning from them. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, the U.S. Office on Colombia, and especially Dana Brown, U.S. Office on Colombia's Executive Director. Dana has been a tireless partner in bringing this idea to fruition, and the USOC's work in connecting civil society leaders with policymakers is an important contribution to ensuring that a plurality of stakeholders are heard in the D.C. discussions about Colombia. In an era of budget cuts, this program is testimony to the power of collaboration. We're grateful to those who have provided the financial and logistical support that made the travel of our Colombian participants possible. And here I'd like to recognize in particular the U.S. Agency for International Development, the UN Development Program in Colombia, Latin America Working Group Education Fund, Mercy Corps, Lutheran World Relief, the Inter-American Foundation, and the Embassy of Colombia. And I believe all of them are listed in the program that you have. We did not have a logo for UNDP, or we neglected to put it on the program, but we'd like to give special recognition to them. Each of those organizations sponsored at least one of the people who is here presenting, taking care of their costs to get them here, and also taking care of trying to link them up with other people in DC who might be interested in talking with them. So I think this is a real example of the kind of collaboration that can really further the impact of the work we're doing. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of our moderators, Cindy Arnson, Mary Roldan, and Maureen Lemke, and the U.S. Office on Colombia and USIP staffs, particularly Asia Frotan, Lori Schultzheim, Ann Hingley, Sharif Ibrahim, and Diego Melo. Peace talks between the government of Colombia and the FARC began last October, after 6 months of secret talks in Havana that produced a roadmap for the way forward. This roadmap identified 6 agenda items for discussion, the first of which is integrated agrarian development. The other agenda items include political participation, victims, illicit crop cultivation, ending the war, and implementation and verification mechanisms. 7 rounds of talks have now been completed, and the parties are continuing to tackle the complex and difficult questions related to land. A consensus between the parties appears to be emerging on the need to address Colombia's highly skewed land tenure system, although the particulars of how to do this are still under discussion. Paving the way for the talks were a series of government initiatives, including a law for victims and land restitution, passed by the Colombian Congress in June 2011. This law seeks to restore stolen and abandoned lands, estimated at 20 million hectares, and provide reparations to some 5 million victims of violence. We will be looking today at some of these issues, and we'll have 3 panels of speakers to discuss the various aspects of the relationship between conflict and peace. I'd like to, without any further ado, turn the program over to Cynthia Arnson and the first panel of speakers, Ricardo Sabogal and Carlos Salgado, and invite you to come to the podium. In the meantime, if anybody needs translation equipment and needs to run out and get it, please, we'll be doing a quick transition and you'll have a minute to do that. Thank you very much for being here.
Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Arnson. When I'm not chairing panels like this, I'm the director of the Latin American program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'd really like to thank USIP and the U.S. Office on Colombia for sponsoring this critically important discussion. As Ginny and others have indicated, the land issue is the first issue on the peace agenda that's currently being negotiated in Havana between the government of Colombia and the guerrillas of the FARC. We all know that anyone who has studied the background to conflict in Colombia knows that land is at the center of it, that displacement has involved millions of people. Land has been taken from peasants in what is, I think, adequately and aptly described as a counter-agrarian reform that took place in the 1980s as paramilitaries and drug traffickers took over large swaths of the Colombian countryside. We're privileged to have two distinguished analysts of the land issue and rural development issues in Colombia to open this discussion. You have their bios, but I'll just briefly mention Absalom Machado, who will speak first. Works as a consultant for the United Nations Development Program. He's the primary researcher on their national report on human development, and really I think is one of one or two or possibly even three of the specialists in Colombia on the agrarian issue. There's really nobody better to speak about this topic. Carlos Salgado also has a long experience working and publishing on questions of internal displacement and on land issues. He's the director of Planeta Paz, a leading NGO that has long worked on questions of the peace process. If they will both be speaking in Spanish, if you do need the translation, please raise your hand and somebody can make a headset appear, I would hope. They will each speak for 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will invite your questions and comments as members of the audience. Thank you. Absolutely.
¿Cuántos minutos? 10?
12 está bien. Hasta 15.
Muy buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your invitation to be here. My presentation will be very brief, even though the issue of the land in Colombia is very complex, and it's really hard to address this issue, including all its different aspects, in such a short time. I would like to start by saying that Colombia has a very complex rural situation where at least 7 elements are part of this problem. I will enumerate them. Permanent structural crisis in the agrarian sector at an institutional, political and social level, a rural industry that has not been considered as a strategic industry in the negotiation process, and we also have a rural development model that has not taken into account the main problems of Colombian rural dwellers. Also, inequality in access to land. There is a great deal of inequality in land tenure. Very precarious institutions in the government in order to address the demands by the rural dwellers, and also an armed conflict that has victimized mainly rural dwellers and that is very closely related to land tenure and the problems related to this. I would also like to say that in terms of land tenure in Colombia and the agrarian issues, at this point we could say that there is a general agreement with regards to the diagnosis of the problem. I'm talking about a agreement between the government, the FARC, and the different components of the Colombian society. The difference, however, in the diagnosis or assessment is in the explanation of the causes of those problems. That's where differences start among the different groups. But I think that the main difference in terms of land tenure in Colombia relies on the policies and instruments as well as strategies to solve these problems. That is where the discussion is happening, and the conversations with the FARC are focused on this. The conversations are taking place in Havana. The problem of land tenure and agrarian structure in Colombia is extremely complex, and I would say that we actually have three different agrarian structures. One is the legal one, another one, the illegal one, and then the informal one. And these structures are interrelated. They're not independent from one another, and they operate in a land tenure scheme that we've called multi-model scheme, so that micro, small, and medium land holdings share spaces in this structure. But right now, we don't have a confrontation like we had during the 1960s. We have a structure where medium-sized land holdings occupy most of the land. We don't have so many micro land holdings and macro land holdings. But this multimodality, this is what we called it, operates within a very unequal framework. Both small, medium, and big land holdings operate within a lot of inequality. The Gini coefficient is really high. At a national level, we're talking of a very high percentage in all the different land holdings, micro, medium, and macro properties. So the problem really of the agrarian structure in Colombia doesn't have to do with sizes. It has to do more with inequality in the structure. That is really the core issue that Colombia has to tackle. And what I wanted to say is that that problem won't be solved applying a traditional agrarian reform, such as the one applied in Colombia during the 1960s until today, which basically was just redistributing big properties. Inequality, in order to solve it, obviously it needs the distribution of land, but it also has to do with access to public goods, access to political participation by rural dwellers, and also it has to do with macroeconomics and different elements that affect the living situation of these rural dwellers.
Agrarian reform, therefore, is more of a rural reform in the sense that it has to start from the redistribution of property, but you can't just stay there. You have to make progress into other aspects as well. So that redistribution or reform has to be differentiated by regions and according to the kinds of modality of the agrarian structure that exists in each region. So where there's more medium-sized or small or large-sized areas, you have to have a different kind of treatment because there are actually some areas where there's more small land holdings, etc. So you must have differentiated kinds of agrarian reform in different areas. But there's a basic thing here, and that is that in Colombia, it's not enough to redistribute land to be able to resolve the problem. You have to attack the factors that contribute to ongoing concentration of property. So the factors that contribute to permanent inequity in the agrarian structure, and those factors are very diverse. I can't name them all here, but we can look at them in a bit. And I believe that given this basic idea that redistribution of land is not enough, but that we need to look at inequity much more in depth, you have now on the agenda the agrarian theme and peace, which is being discussed now, which is right now in Colombia. I'd say that there are 4 proposals for the solution of the rural problems. There's a government proposal, which is expressed basically in the bill that's up for discussion right now in Congress. There's the proposal from the peasant farmer sector that comes from the Round Table of Agrarian Unity, from the group of small farming organizations, and they have their own proposal for a bill. There's also the proposal of the FARC, and they have been publishing this proposal recently in a very extensive list of propositions about the rural issue in general, not just lands. And I would say that there's also a proposal on the part of some organizations, some that come from the Society of agriculturalists or large farmers in Colombia, and those that come from the ranching organization as well. They have a very radical position of opposing the peace dialogue, and they don't even accept that there is a problem of, or the need to redistribute land, or that there's a problem of inequity. So there are some very clear points of discord in the discussion and debate on the issue of land at this point. I would say that the main points of discord in the current discussion have to do with the autonomy of the areas that the FARC has called rural peasant farming areas, which are the zones of farming reserves where foodstuffs are produced. There is a proposal for autonomy in this area, and there's discord with the government and especially with military groups in this respect. Another point of disagreement has to do with how to apply the right to the land surface area. This is something to try to improve the use of the law. And there's also discrepancies about how much to allow foreign investors to invest in land in Colombia. The FARC has said that foreign investors should not be allowed to purchase large amounts of land, that there could be very regulated foreign purchases or investment in land. There's also discrepancies in terms of the limitations or proposals for prohibiting mining or energy projects. Those are issues are generating conflicts in rural areas. And there's also discrepancies in the concepts that the small farmer organizations and the FARC have in terms of food security and self-sufficiency. And another discrepancy has would to be legalized for pharmaceutical and other purposes. The government does not have a proposal in that respect. And there's also some differences on the issue of whether genetically modified organisms should be allowed in Colombia. So this is just a sample of the kinds of discrepancies that exist between the proposals of the government, of the trade organizations, and the FARC and the small farmers. And there are other issues that are also very well, there are many points. I would say to modify the agrarian structure without generating new conflicts. And I think the basic problem is, how do you resolve the land issue in Colombia without creating new conflicts? It wouldn't make sense to have a whole process of reorganizing property structures if it's just going to create more conflicts. And so that is the fundamental point that we need to pay a lot of attention to. How can we begin to modify this structure in the short and medium term medium and long-term process. It's not going to be a short-term process. And at the same time, how can resolve some of those conflicts around all of those issues? And to end, I would like to say that Colombia is in a situation where it cannot waste the opportunity to reach agreements on how to begin to resolve the problem of lands and the agrarian situation in Colombia. It's an opportunity that comes around only once in every 50 years. And there are a lot of things that have to be covered to be able to do this. I would say that the most important one, in terms of the fact that there's going to be some accords and that we need to implement the accords, is how to strengthen government institutionality in rural areas. There's a great precariousness in terms of government institutions in rural areas. We need to reinvent institutions in Colombia to be able to have a good post-conflict policy. The state must clearly define a policy for peasant farmers. The great point of discussion in Havana is how to support peasant farmers in this process and make sure that they can participate in the various organizations of social and political participation in Colombia. We must have a new land administration system in Colombia. We have a very chaotic system at this point with too many problems, too many legal complexities in Colombia in the post-conflict years. If we want to resolve these problems, is going to have to definitively clarify a system for administering lands that includes information, surveying, a land registry system, and all of the instruments that are proposed in the law about vacant lands and various kinds of lands. We definitely also have to resolve the agrarian problem if we want to make any progress towards peace. And though it is not the only factor, it is necessary and it is urgent. And I would like to end by saying the following. If you see the government proposals on one side and the FARC proposals on the other that are being put forth in Havana, I interpret them in the following way. The government is putting their efforts behind something that they believe is realistic politically and administratively according to their capacities. And for me, it begins with clarifying who rural property belongs to in Colombia. And there's a very serious problem there because it's not clear who owns various pieces of land, and the land that has been taken away by force must be returned. There must be restitution of that land. Secondly, the government proposal includes a modernization of the land administration system. Third, change in the soil use. I think we have a lot of inefficiency that needs to be dealt with at this point. And in fourth place, the limitations of peasant farmer reserve areas and public lands, and we need to decide how far the farming frontier should extend. We need to have a sort of regulations on land use and zoning in that sense. So when I see it, the theme of land redistribution is the last point in the government's proposal. From the point of the FARC, now they begin with redistribution of land and with the reserved areas for peasant farmers. And then they go on to the after redistribution and reorganization and zoning and land use regulation. They move on to clarifying the who are the actual property owners to resolve the problem of legality and illegality in land ownership. And then finally, they put land use and modernization at the end of their list of priorities. So we have two different paths that are actually moving in different directions in terms of the proposals of the two sides, and there's some coinciding on both sides. But they are talking about this issue of land now in Havana, and so the government is working with this realism of trying to modernize and redistribute land, which would, we'll have to see what comes out of Havana there. And then the FARC is talking about redistribution for small farmers, and their dialogue is linked more to political idealism of having a democratic society where peasant farmers have a lot of participation. So between the government realism and the idealism of the FARC, we have a lot of debate right now on the land issue in Colombia. Thank you.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the U.S. Institute for Peace and the U.S. Office on Colombia for the opportunity to participate in this forum. I'm going to read some notes that I have to try to cover everything I want to cover in 15 minutes. I want to begin talking about why peace in Colombia must deal with the rural issues. And I'm going to talk about various tendencies that I believe are key in this moment in Colombia to be able to make progress in negotiation and the construction of peace. Secondly, the challenges that I believe are very important in terms of dealing with the rural transformation and building peace. And third, to give a context to the negotiations between the government and the guerrilla at this point. And fourth, to talk about the importance of the zones of small farmer reserves. So what has to do with the trends at this point? I think the first trend is that the Colombian state has never had a policy of recognizing, managing, and controlling territory at the national level. The rural policy has been based on distributing vacant lands, giving concessions, and trying to stimulate the building of productive islands, whether those are plantation economies or the development of so-called commercial agriculture. These islands have been protected by economic, political mechanisms as well as coercion. And there are private profits and public profits that are generated. Outside of these islands, the land is built through various forms of power without the constitution of rights, through whose where all of the legal and illegal actors have traveled in the country. For this reason, the rural policy really catalyzed conflicts, and you cannot explain conflicts without the rural issue. The second trend or tendency is that the state has a double policy with respect to small farmers: partial integration and relative devaluing of another sector. Of those who were integrated, they were given certain rights, for example, a marginal redistribution of land, a link to some institutional programs, and certain political affiliations to traditional parties. To those who were devalued completely, they have been systematically denied all their rights. This kind of policy deepened the heterogeneity among small farmers and defined the context of their protests and their demands. And so there have been various political loyalties that have been developed with various relationships between armed actors. This policy was broken during the 1990s and is recovered in the Santos government. which is one of the key aspects of his rupture with the political design of Álvaro Uribe, even though he still has the same model of production in rural areas. And President Santos recognizes the importance of the rural issue in the negotiation with the FARC, and he understands that without recovering a certain kind of connection to this between the small farmers and the state, it would be impossible to negotiate with the guerrillas. This understanding of the current government explains their interest for returning land to part of the population whose land was taken from them, and to distribute some public lands or vacant lands of the states to other small farmers. The third trend is the following. The model of rural development changed starting from the 1990s, and now instead of putting emphasis on productive islands and letting anything happen in the rest of the territory, it's also now included the constant broadening of the agricultural frontier, and there has been a proposal to control all of the resources in all of the territories, which changes the old power relationships that used to exist in the countryside. Another change between Santos and Uribe is that they have tried to have more leadership from the central government rather than the local governments. And there has been the law of territorial ordering or zoning, and the fiscal laws that have been an example of this new emphasis. The new rural model also modifies rural institutions, but there is a huge gap in this respect, because the state has still not been able to define an overall strategy for the territories, much less define the institutions that would be appropriate for them. The fourth tendency. If the idea of partial integration of peasant farmers and the relative devaluing of other farmers is still an issue, it's not clear how many are going to be will be benefited by this policy of President Santos because of the transformations that are happening in the territories outside of the conflicts over development. It's not clear who will end up benefiting from this situation. Colombia today is a breeding ground of conflicts created by the way in which political calls to development have been operationalized, whether it's mining, infrastructure, timber, palm oil, free trade zones. These kinds of structures deepen the dispossession of people from their territory and their resources. And so it has to do with the way in which the state is establishing alliances with the people who are leading these projects, and how the peasant farmer sector is being excluded from these conversations. The fifth tendency is that we must recognize and support the efforts of the government and the FARC to reach an agreement and flexibilize their positions with respect to the rural issue. From my point of view, the FARC particularly have made an effort to expand their perspective on the theme with respect to what were their positions in the agrarian program of the guerrillas from 1964, the additions they made to that in the 8th Conference, and other statements. It's not clear at this point how flexible the government will be at the negotiating table, though they are making some changes in the law of victims, restitution of land, and other such matters. So I think at this moment there are several challenges to peace in terms of the rural issues, and some of the challenges are the following. In what way will the territories be managed, especially in the context of the reprimarizing of the economy? Are the zoning laws and the redistribution of royalties enough to guarantee equity, redistribution, and political participation? especially resources that come from oil and mining that the government collects in a central fund, will that be enough for redistribution and for building dynamics to build peace? What will be the institutional rural model that will allow local powers to manage land and public resources, to be able to strengthen the integration of peasant farmers and other groups that are negotiating the end to the conflict? And how will the state deal with the tension between development, negotiation, and the construction of peace in an era in which the bases for economic growth are basically based on the exploitation of raw materials that are available, particularly in rural areas? Can these answers emerge as part of the agreements that are going to be signed in Havana? It seems to me that we need to talk now about the negotiation. Neither government nor the FARC, much less the political or technocrat elites in Colombia, have been able to have an integrated look at what's happening in rural areas. And this causes risks for the way in which the territories are controlled. For example, the rural development laws being proposed and the integrated rural development proposals have very fragmented visions for the future. And this is a great challenge for the future. But it's clear, first of all, that if negotiation of armed conflict is not exactly peace, it's a very important step towards peace because it helps to fix the critical situation of the regions and the territories. And it helps to free the autonomy of the social and popular organizations who will have greater freedom to be able to operate. It allows the possibility of reconstructing local power, local politics. It also adds ethical values to democracy when it tries to disarticulate drug trafficking. Brings together again the sense of the public, supports the recognition of various actors, and supports processes of redistribution in favor of peasant farmers. And it could tip the balance more towards the integration of peasant farmers and less towards the exclusion and devaluation of peasant farmers in public policies. So in terms of the management of the territory, I would say there's one thing that is certain. The popular sectors can make a substantial contribution if they change and have a more integrated vision of Colombian territory through the strategy of building small farmer reserve zones. This proposal, which is being led by the National Association of Reserva Campesina, ANSORC, has the intention of assigning 9 million hectares for this effect out of 50 million hectares that are being used currently in Colombia for agriculture, forests, and grasslands. So this is just a fourth of the land that is being used very inefficiently at this point by ranchers, especially for grazing land. And it is double the amount of the land used historically in agricultural, because in the past it has been a limit of 4.5 million hectares. So the government should support this proposal, not just to concretize the peace strategies, but also because this process will be useful for democracy if from the negotiation of the peace there is a legitimate state, that the population sees the state as legitimate. Second, if there is levels of integration of the rural population where more people are included than excluded in the rural population. And Third, if it promotes concrete political ways of acting for development strategies and for the guerrillas to participate and negotiate politically. I think this explains why peace must include discussion of how to broaden democracy in rural areas. If we understand democracy to include the following: first, the recognition of actors that have been historically devalued and excluded in the social, cultural, and political economic policies of Colombia. Secondly, it would contribute to the deconcentration of power and control over land. And third, it would help to redistribute assets in favor of historically unrecognized actors. This is why I believe that peace must include the discussion of rural issues in Colombia. Thank you.
Presentations which, if nothing else, have demonstrated the incredible complexity, of the theme and the difficulty of advancing in a short period of time, not only in the talks in Havana, but in the implementation of the land restitution and victims law that is currently being applied. There are 2 microphones on either side. If people have questions or comments, please line up, and for the benefit of everyone in the room, please tell us who you are. Por favor.
Me llamo Jim Jones y soy ex.
My name is Jim Jones, and I'm a former Army advisor from the Andean region. I'm sorry, the interpreter is getting too much echo. I'm asking, how is it possible to talk about resolving the agrarian problem in Colombia without touching the economic model? Thank you.
I agree with both speakers that passing through the rural aspects of peace is incredibly important and fundamental to understanding the roots of the Colombian conflict and its solutions. However, given the process that has gone forward in Colombia over the years of the conflict, we see a situation in which hundreds of thousands of former campesinos are now living in towns and cities. Many of the problems that both of you underscored are present in these towns and cities, especially the question of urban land. So I wonder if the peace agreement, the peace talks, are encompassing this aspect. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take perhaps one more comment or question, and then we'll return to the panel. Go ahead.
Following a little bit the question that Jim asked, we were talking a little bit about the importance of finding a solution to the conflict, and that this must include issues having to do with land tenure and land ownership. And that makes me think that we're not talking at the negotiating table about subsoil rights. And I wonder if not dealing with this issue at this point might cause new conflicts in terms of energy issues, because the government is continuing to give more and more concessions to transnational companies for mining and energy projects in rural areas.
No sé si quién quiere comentar. Absalón, Carlos. Luego es usted.
Es cierto que el gobierno colombiano hasta ahora no ha abierto la discusión sobre el modelo de desarrollo general que lleva Colombia, y creo que ese punto va a ser un poco relegado en la discusión, pero sí creo que en el camino esa discusión va a saltar y va a ser necesario entrar en ella. Hay dos aspectos que me parece importantes tener en cuenta en esa inquietud. La primera quizás es que la política macroeconómica es tal vez la parte más restrictiva para el desarrollo rural. Nosotros tenemos una política macroeconómica que le cierra espacios al desarrollo rural de muchas maneras. Y el asunto es en qué medida estos acuerdos de paz van a tener la capacidad de abrirle un espacio al desarrollo rural como política del Estado de manera permanente, no como una cosa simplemente ocasional o resultado de la negociación, que una vez que se le da curso puede volver nuevamente al olvido. Y creo que eso pasa por introducirle flexibilidades a la política macroeconómica en el manejo básicamente de la revaluación, que es uno de los factores que más está afectando el desarrollo de la agricultura en Colombia por las grandes importaciones de alimentos y porque el sector industrial también anda en decaída por la revaluación, y es evidente que no se puede hacer introducciones o cambios en un modelo de desarrollo que genere más oportunidades y más empleos si no hay una política de industrialización en Colombia. Y desafortunadamente el plan de desarrollo actual no consideró a la industria como una de las locomotoras del desarrollo. Y ahí hay un problema muy serio que yo creo que el país tiene que enfrentarlo definitivamente. Esto no puede pasar sin estar en la discusión cómo flexibilizar la política macroeconómica. Y en segundo lugar, creo que hay otro espacio de discusión que se va a tener que dar necesariamente, y es que en materia de desarrollo rural Colombia podría, porque tiene los elementos para hacerlo, empezar a trabajar modelos diferenciados de desarrollo rural a nivel territorial, que sean modelos que dialoguen con la política macroeconómica, o sea, con las grandes políticas del Estado, que no sean modelos que vayan totalmente en contradicción y en contravía, sino que tengan esa posibilidad de dialogar con un modelo más general. Pero creo que las regiones tienen elementos, experiencias y posibilidades de empezar a identificar modelos diferenciados de desarrollo rural.
Identify the different models, and it would include some flexibility in the rural development model, which even though is included in a more rigid framework, it could include differences depending on the region. I think this discussion should happen. I think it has. And it has to be included in the general negotiations. And yes, I do agree that that Colombia has a very serious problem. You know that the subsoil rights prevail over the rights of soil use. That's in the Constitution. In the discussion that we are currently having, this issue is not present. So that's another discussion that we need in Colombia. It's a fundamental issue. What prevails? The right for families to feed themselves or to exploit the subsoil? That's an issue for lawyers of constitutional law, for Colombia as a whole. And I think it is going to be really hard to avoid this discussion because the mining and energetic exploitation models will generate a lot of conflict and is actually generating a lot of conflict, and the government will have to find an equilibrium between those rights because some rights prevail over others. In other words, the right for rural families to feed themselves is very important. Addresses something mentioned by many sectors in Colombia. The discussions were focused on changing the model, but some sectors also discussed the following. It is true that the negotiations cannot really address every single issue of the country. The negotiation has to be understood as a space where, at this point, can allow us to open up the political dialogue, where we can have different positions heard that were subject to other elements of power, and also it could be a space to bring up issues to be discussed. So the negotiation with the guerrilla might not be the place where we could have that change in the model. I think there is some awareness and acceptance that the negotiation has to be understood the way it should be, and it has to be complemented by many different activities that include different agendas, and that would allow us to see how the government sees things. Also, the general public understands the 6 points addressed in the Havana agenda are those 6, and that we need to understand, we need to see how we could add on other issues. But expecting a solution stemming from the Havana negotiations to all problems seems quite impossible nowadays. We do need to include in the discussion rural issues. This is extremely important in a context such as the one we have in Colombia, because the fundamental scenario of conflict in Colombia is a rural world. That's where most of the actors that destabilize institutions are. That's where conflict in the different territories happens, and that's where different very powerful groups have confronted each other, defending their own interests. If we manage to break this vicious circle and this structure of the armed conflict, we would have a very big space for organizations to come forward and bring their concrete proposals. The Association of Indigenous Peoples in the northern region of El Cauca said that it is important to put an end to the war, because the war absorbs 90% of their time. They need to continuously be defending themselves from the impacts of the war, conducting exercises to try to withdraw the youth from the groups, these armed groups. And they need the time to do other things. They said that if the war doesn't end, this relationship would be reverted. If the war actually ended, this relationship would be reverted. They could spend more time on productive projects and less time addressing issues. If we manage to transform the rural world, that would be a beginning for a change in the model. That would be a first step. And we've taken on a very pragmatic position in this regard to try to change policies in Colombia.
And we have a line of people that want to ask questions, so I'll ask you to be really brief, and we'll come back one more time to the... Go ahead.
Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Mauricio Albarracín.
My name is Mauricio Albarracín. Both said that the issue of land has to do with the political participation. We have a technocrat elite in power. How will the government, with their aristocratic policies, solve the problem?
Soy
Dorli Castañeda, visiting researcher from Georgetown University. I have 2 questions. I want to see what a middle ground solution would be. You talked about the realism by the government, the idealistic approach by the FARC. Which would be the common ground between those 2 different paths? And then how can we make democracy grow, and what would be the role of international organizations in this regard, especially United Nations and other countries that with which some sort of agreement has been signed? Thank you. Lina Céspedes, PhD student. I have two questions that I will summarize actually in one. How can we avoid this land restitution law from creating more victims or campesinos, and how could we avoid them from being protected by the law just in a temporary way? When we had the displacement problem, we created a legal individual called displaced person, and now we have displaced people asking other things that could be or having other demands that could be actually similar to those demands by the campesinos.
Aaron Thompson, Department of State. I have a question that's similar to one of the previous questions about the intersection between realism and idealism of the FARC. Just a question of what elements do you think any potential agreement between the FARC and the government on land reform would include, and what is the possibility that they will come to this agreement in the near future? Thank you.
I'd like to put one last question on the table, which is that both speakers have talked about a model of rural development essentially as a government decision. But we know that Colombia and the whole world is, exists within globalization. The number of free trade agreements has expanded. The number of companies that are exporting to Colombia, and that has an obvious impact on rural producers in terms of prices and the viability, of small farms. And so I was wondering if either of you could comment on the international environment in which rural development takes place, and whether there are models in either Latin America or other places in the world that have successfully met this challenge of globalization in maintaining a vibrant rural economy based on campesinos. If we can solve all these questions, we can probably solve peace in Colombia. We'll start with Carlos and corriendo.
Bueno, antes algo que preguntar.
Someone asked about urban land that is not been addressed. That is being addressed in Havana, but there hasn't been a lot of progress in this regard. The Minister of Agriculture said that the proposal of the 50 campesino reserve zones that are being requested, that would have some advantages and priorities for the indigenous people, he said that is not constitutional. But with all due respect, I think the minister is completely wrong. On the contrary, the state should actually massively focus on supporting the creation of these areas, providing autonomy to the campesinos so that they can actually implement social policies and conduct their activities in these areas with very strong support by the Colombian government. If the government actually ignores these areas, these campesino areas, I think they would be making a great mistake, and we would have very undesirable situations in these areas when it comes to building peace. And I think the minister's position would also be really wrong, given the context that we have, where most of the actors in the Colombian conflict control, for example, 4 times more hectares than the campesinos are asking for, such as ranchers. So I think the government would be wrong if they don't allow for this type of autonomy and don't support the campesinos in order to build democracy. I think it's a way of supporting the people, and I think the minister's position doesn't really have a justifiable explanation, especially since we're trying to build peace. If one doesn't want to support democracy, then they might ignore this type of spaces. We need to try to avoid the generation of more conflict, and that's why we are granting more rights. if the state doesn't intervene in the way that the territory is being distributed and so on and so forth, we won't be contributing too much to peace, even if we negotiate with the guerrilla. I think that if we promote this type of participation, relative autonomy, and support by the government, I think this also would prevent the restitution from being just a moment in that long process. And this would be a good effort by the government to try to provide those families that were stripped from their lands. If there is not a dynamic policy that would allow these people to establish themselves in certain regions, we will witness in the short term more conflict. So I think it is necessary to call on the government. I think also the international community has a role to play in this regard. They could really contribute to peace building, and they could contribute to help stabilize the population in these territories with social and political changes in the country. I would like to start with the last question, which was the easiest one, that has to do with the trade agreements and their relation with small farmers and campesinos. What can these small farmers do in such an international context? I think this is another issue that won't change in the short term. And when I say this, I mean these trade agreements that are being signed. This takes us to another different type of discussion, and it's the following. Small farmers also need some transformation, not only at a productive level, but in the way they organize themselves. They have to overcome their individualism, and they have to organize themselves in collectives. They need public policies, too, that will open up new opportunities for them within the rural sector. And it doesn't have necessarily to be in terms of agricultural production. If we don't have an industrialization policy, it will be really hard to offer new options and opportunities for the rural people to reintegrate in the productive society as a whole. So we need to overcome this traditional idea of campesinos being just agricultural workers. The free trade agreement of the Americas, I think, brings up this discussion, and it has to be addressed. We need to transform small farmers. They need to make sure that they become part of this modernization process, and it doesn't have to be necessarily just focused on agricultural production. As I said, this is inevitable. We need to do this, and we need also to have policies such as the ones we see in Brazil, for example. They have a very important government program to help families, rural families, modernize themselves, and also policies where small producers are very much supported by the government. Chile is a very good example. I know the situation is not comparable, but it is an example that we could follow. We can't just focus on the fact that free trade agreements really go against campesino or small farmers. I think we need to address this challenge in a different way. Then in terms of the common ground between the government's position and the FARC's position, I don't know if you read the two press releases by the FARC that they published since negotiations started. There are 28 pages with 10 points addressed in detail. If you read those press releases, you will really find very interesting proposals and common ground with the government. I am sure there are differences in terms of the emphasis that they put on different topics, but I do think there is common ground between both parties. We need to take into account, though, one thing. We can't forget that on the one hand we have the proposals of the FARC, and on the other hand we have the government's proposals. And while these proposals have some common aspects, for example, the FARC agree that we need to put an end to the conflicts related to the land use and tenure and so on and so forth. So there is no doubt that they agree with that. The government has also presented this point. They agree on improving the land administration systems. There are a lot of intersection points, but there is a fundamental point in their agenda. Those agreements, those common points, are included in two different political discourses. One is the one by the FARC, and the other one is by the government. And I think that is where we have the nuances, and we have to see what's going to happen with the implementation of such points, so that when instruments are defined or concrete strategies are defined, how they will tackle these issues. For example, productive land. Everyone believes that big size land holdings have to be eradicated, but then the way this is done, that's where differences happen. For example, the FARC is suggesting to tax this land, to sell them, and the government probably has a different approach to this, and they say, no, let's create other incentives to address this point, and so on and so forth. So I do think there is common ground. I do think there are points where that they agree on, but it's their approach that is different. The FARC has a different discourse from the one of the government. The FARC has a historical discourse that hasn't really changed, even though some changes have been introduced, and that's why there can be an agreement in certain points. In addition to this, we can't forget that all those points that have been published through press releases by the FARC show their political agenda and are focused more on that than on the discussions that are taking place in the Havana.
The panelists, and immediately invite the second panel to come on up. Excelente.
never good when you need it. Let me see if yours works. I was just saying that, no, still can't hear anything. So, there we go. Okay. For those of you who perhaps need a headset for translation purposes while we're finishing up the logistics, I think we're okay now. There are some available in the hallway. I'm Mary Roldan, and I'm the moderator for today. It gives me great pleasure to be here. I'm a professor of Latin American history at the City University of New York at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, and I've worked on issues of violence and displacement in Colombia as a historian. Today's speakers cover a wide variety of specialties and topics, and we're going to start with Ricardo Sabogal, who is currently the director for the Colombian government's unit for the restitution of lands, Unidad de Restitución de Tierras, but who also has a long experience in dealing with these issues. He is a Colombian lawyer and a specialist in economics. He was one of the youngest mayors elected in 2001 for Cundinamarca. And he has 8 years of experience in the protection program for displaced peoples in the Land and Patrimony Project. I'm going to do all of the introductions, and then we'll do our speakers. We'll have an opportunity to either speak at the podium or to direct the audience from here in their seat at the podium. Our second speaker is Zoraida Castillo Varela, who serves as the Lutheran World Relief's Country Director for Colombia. She leads the development and implementation of LWR's programming in Colombia, and she works with LWR internationally to ensure that programs in Colombia help advance that organization's mission of helping to end poverty, injustice, and human suffering in the world. A very large agenda. Yes, good luck with that, as they say. Angela Suarez Alvarez is our third speaker, and she comes to us as well with a great deal of experience. She's an international lawyer with 10 years of professional practice in human rights and victims issues, and with extensive experience on policy making and program management issues related to victims of the conflict. She has worked for USAID Colombia for the last 4 years, and she currently serves as the manager for the Victims Institutional Strengthening Program. So thank you very much. Please welcome our guests, and we'll begin with Ricardo Sabogal.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to this event. And thank you for coming this Wednesday afternoon to see what we can learn from the country and how to return land to the dispossessed. What I want to talk about today is how the country is dealing with the policy since the Victims Law and the Law for Restitution of Lands was approved in Congress. What kind of preparations have we made at the institutional level? And how is this law being implemented? So I will give my presentation along those lines and in that order in the very brief 15 minutes that I'm given. The first thing that the country did, as soon as the restitution law was passed, the government looked for information that would help to understand the dimension of the problem of the dispossession of land, or the and information was very different. Some NGOs said they were 10 million hectares have been taken away from people. Other people said 1 million hectares. Other very extreme sectors said that no land has been taken away from anyone. What we have is economic migrants going to the city. The first thing we did was to begin to look at what was the real dimension of the problem. And from there, we tried to work with some very serious organizations and universities to make some estimates. And we found some studies that show that in the last 20 years in the country, it's possible that approximately 4 million hectares could have been abandoned. And approximately 2 million hectares could have definitely been taken away illegally. And so with the issue of abandoned lands, it doesn't mean that peasant farmers have not been able to go back. In some points in the last 20 years of the country, people left land. Some of them were able to return to lands, others were not able to return. And so that was the situation that we had described to us as we began our process. Now, the other thing we looked at is, where is the problem? Where are the displaced people living now? And so we looked for the places where the most displaced people were living. And we also looked for where the lands were that had been abandoned or that had been illegally taken. And given this information, the first thing the government did was to begin to structure the various government institutions that were created as a result of the victims' law for land restitution processes. And the law provided for 2 institutions to develop the restitution policy. One that would be in the government, which is the organization that I'm heading, which is the land restitution unit, and the other is in the judicial level, where we have specialized judges who have a specialization in land restitution. Now, the national government tried to locate all of the affected areas and began to create these institutions to establish them in various parts, various regions. And we began to work with judges to begin to train those who were going to be in charge of making decisions on these cases of land restitution. In 2012, the Land Restitution Unit opened offices in 15 of the most affected departments. And in this year, we've been able to open up offices in 2 more departments. The restitution judges in 2012 started to operate in all of the areas where the land restitution units were operating as well. So then we began to give structure to the process of the applications that people were presenting. And so in the large cities where they're the most displaced people, we started to receive petitions or applications, and what we did was we established some requirements. Come and tell us the story of how your land was taken away. Don't worry about documents right now, just tell us. And starting with that information, we began to build the case. And this is very complex in the country because, as was said just a short time ago by the previous presenters, the issue of land management in our country has many problems. Many peasant farmers do not have titles for their properties. There's a high level of informality in this respect. And so when people come to place an application or a request, it becomes very complex. Some people come and they tell what happened, who took their land away from them, but they don't have titles to prove that they ever owned that land. And so that implies an enormous effort to try to identify where those lands are. And so the government has linked together the property registry offices and the land surveying offices together so that they can deal with these issues more quickly. But the initial information that we receive is very important because sometimes the peasant farmers are not on any list that we might have of displaced people. And so the Land Restitution Unit uses Google. And we start with the peasant farmers to locate where their lands are on Google Maps. And if the peasant farmer is young, it's very likely that they might find their piece of land very quickly. They might say, it's in this area. But if not, if it's someone who is elderly, it becomes a little bit more complicated. because using Google Earth to find the land can be a very complicated matter for them. But what have we done? What we've done is to begin to have train people who are specialized in land survey and registry issues in certain areas. And so when someone says, I had to abandon my land in a certain area of the country, that engineer knows that that land, he might ask, is it by such and such a river? Do you remember such and such a road or a path? Yes. And here's this road and here's this path. And they show them on Google Maps. And so the person is able to show them according to the guidance that the specialized engineers are providing. And so that might last 30 seconds, it might take an hour, or it might last for days because the person perhaps doesn't know and they have to bring a family member. And it's extremely important to identify the lands, because if we don't identify the lands, we're not going to be able to restore them to their owners. So at the beginning, I have to confess that we were taking a long time. But as the team got more and more specialized, the time improved in terms of how long it took for the interviews and for the processes to begin. Now, these interviews always operate under the principle of good faith. We believe people. We do ask for evidence, but if they don't have titles, or if the titles have been burned or lost, we look for those titles in registry offices and we start to put together a file. And they say that the guerrillas push them out or the paramilitary groups push them out. And so with our government databases or with press reports, or perhaps in the libraries of the various universities that talk about the times of the conflict and where the conflict raged in different parts of the countries at different times, we start to put together the story of what happened. So first of all, we look to see where the land is. And with the Ministry of Defense, we look to see if there's any security problems that might get in the way of the restitution process. Because you have to remember that there's a huge challenge in the country. There's a restitution policy that's being implemented in the midst of a conflict, and the restitution policies like these have never been implemented in the midst of a conflict. They've always waited until after the end of a war. But in Colombia, we are beginning them in the period of wartime, and that implies a huge degree of effort in the area of security. So we look to see where the land is. We try to see if there's a high concentration of requests in certain areas, and the Defense Ministry tells us whether or not we have good or bad security conditions in the country. And if we have decent security conditions, we start to process the restitution process. It's supposed to last between 8 and 12 months, according to law. But what we do is we go to the area and we tell people in the lands that the restitution process have begun. And together with the communities, we start to reconstruct the story of land that was taken away from people in those areas. So it's like putting together a puzzle, because in many of the areas where the processes are moving forward, the territory changed abruptly. Perhaps there used to be a mango tree that no longer exists. Now perhaps there's a big plantation there. Maybe there's some large agro-industry operating there. Or it may have been abandoned for 20 years, so it's impossible to reconstruct where the various plots of land were. So we have to go to the area, and we have to begin to talk with the peasant farmers, ask them why they're there, how they purchased the lands, who sold the land to them, and we check on the legitimacy of those titles. And depending on the information that we receive, and the people that are there, as well as the victim, we decide whether it is a case that deserves being taken forward to the judges. And I have described this very simply, but it's a very complicated process. First of all, because nobody wants land to be taken away from them. And a lot of time people have spent years on that land, and so there's negative reactions as well. So we know that, and we have to deal with that as well. So we try to accompany the process with the national police who go out with us to the areas, and we're also providing security for those who are presenting the petitions to reclaim their lands. So we give the case to the judge. And then the judge has about 4 months to issue a decision on the case, to decide whether or not restitution of that land should or should not take place. And based on the information about from the people who are on the land and the information that we supply, they make a decision. And so what I have told you here in a very succinct form is basically the process. Right now we have 30,000 applications where peasant farmers are asking for a total of more than 2 million hectares back. And when I say 2 million hectares, I'm not talking about 2 million hectares in a particular geographic hectares, because sometimes peasant farmers are asking for restitution of the same land. Remember, in the history of Colombia, land has been taken away throughout history. So some people were deprived of the same piece of land in the 1990s, and others were run out of the land in other years. And so you might have more than one victim claiming the same piece of land. So you have overlap on the hectares. And some may say they have legal ownership, and others say, well, we have ownership because we lived there for so long. And so where it's not necessarily 2 million geographic hectares that we're talking about. Of these 30,000 applications that have been filed currently, we have found that about 70% of the country offers security situations that are good enough to be able to move forward with the process. And we've been able to deal with about 6,000 cases. In many of these cases, the verification of the land has already happened, and the case has been turned over to the judges who are working on the land restitution issues. About 1,500 cases are already in the hands of judges. And in the 8 to 10 months that the law gives us, in order to satisfy the rulings of the law, the judges have begun to make decisions. I think there have been about 40 decisions so far that have to do with about 200 cases. And every day decisions are being issued now. There are some emblematic cases that decisions have been made on, cases that people never imagined would be resolved so quickly. We began to take away land from some of the worst mafias in the country in areas where the state had not had a presence before. We have been doing this very quickly. And so for you to get an idea of the dimension of the effectiveness of this law, you might be able to compare it with the previous law, which was the Justice and Peace law, which was signed within the process of the demobilization of the self-defense group. They so far only have 12 or 14 decisions that have been made. But now, in the short period of time that we've had with the victims law, we have more than 40 decisions that have come out from the judges. And why? Because we have given effective example. If someone has been found guilty of drug trafficking or anything, then there's no thought at all of allowing them to have the land. And so that was the way we were able to take away land from the Castaño Mafia. In just 4 months, we were able to take a good number of hectares away from this group, and we're going to continue to take land away from them because they have been found guilty. And there's no discussion, no reason that we should allow them to keep that land. This is a policy that has been very effective in the country. We are transforming the way in which justice is being done. The country has never had before this kind of justice that works for the peasant farmers. A lot of problems that we've had in the country is because we haven't had a justice system that has dealt with agrarian conflicts. So we're going right there. We're going to the land issues, and it's starting to work. And the interesting thing is this is a free service as well. Civil the peasant farmers were not able to access the justice system before because they didn't have a way to pay to take cases. But now they are able to rule on these cases of stolen lands without paying any money at all. And so that is generally how things are working in the country. Thank you very much.
Our speakers are doing a marvelous job of synthesizing a great deal of very complex material. Our next speaker is Zoraida Castillo from the Lutheran World Relief.
Buenas tardes. Agradezco.
Relief. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the U.S. Office in Colombia and USIP for the invitation to speak here. My presentation is going to focus primarily on the perspectives of the communities in the Caribbean coast where Lutheran Relief works. These are their perspectives on the implementation of the Victims' Law. Very briefly, I can say that Lutheran World Relief is a U.S. organization of humanitarian aid and development that works in 19 countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In Colombia, we began working in the Caribbean region, as I said, working with communities who have been victims of the armed conflict, especially displaced populations, people who are displaced by the armed conflict. As many of you know, the Caribbean region has been particularly hard hit by the armed conflict, and because of the war, more than 2 million hectares were abandoned in the Caribbean coast. And in Montes de Maria alone, between 1997 and 2007, in a period of 10 years, 200,000 people had to leave their lands. We're talking about approximately 81,000 hectares of land that were abandoned. Lutheran World Relief, along with our local partners in the Caribbean region, we work with peasant farmer, indigenous, and Afro-Colombian communities. And we accompany the communities to be able to recover their productive bases. And we also have supported communities who have stayed on their land despite the conflicts. When the communities received the news that the Victims' Law and the land restitution law had been approved, they were very happy about it because they felt like it was an important step in terms of recognizing their rights. But we also could see that they had many reservations about whether or not this law could be truly implemented and whether it would become a reality. They had concerns about that because in the Caribbean coast of Colombia, there have been many local powers against the interests of small farmers. Unfortunately, the Caribbean region has been famous for forest displacement and the operation of paramilitary groups in the economy and the politics of the region. 1 year after the law was passed in June 2012, Lutheran World Relief and the Latin American Working Group with Lisa Haggard, we decided to take a trip to the Caribbean coast to find about the progress of the implementation of the Victims' Law. Now, at that time, not a single hectare of land had been restored through the mechanisms that had been contained in the law, although we know now, as Dr. Ricardo has said, we have had some progress to date, especially some decisions made by the 40 judges and 15 magistrates who have been especially named for work on these cases. But we heard a lot of stories from men and women, peasant farmers, about how they saw the land situation, and we heard their concerns about restitution. They would tell us, sadly, that the mining companies, the cement companies, the palm oil companies, the GMO corn companies, and the tourism companies were displacing them every day. And for a lot of people, it was like a counter-agrarian reform. They told us that the land that they used to grow crops, the water sources, and rural roads were increasingly being controlled by a few powerful groups. If I had more time for this presentation, I could tell you about the Berlin Wall story. It was a wall that we found in San Pablo de Córdoba. It was a wall that we went over, and we found a large plantation of GMO corn. We can also tell you about the young people in the north of Bolívar who told us about their agricultural projects. They had pigs, but the pigs were dying because of the electric fences of the large companies that were next to them, that were owned by the palm oil companies. And there were a lot of stories like this about how hard it was to grow food and to have production in those areas. One very interesting and hopeful thing was to be able to listen to the government officials who talked about the law as being a tool for bringing justice to the victims. But we also realized that the implementation was going to be very difficult because of the lack of resources for implementation. So we were able to verify that the processes of land restitution have many obstacles. To restore land to the true owners is going to be very difficult. And it's going to be very difficult to take this land away from people who obtained it in bad faith and by force. It's an immense challenge for the government. With this trip that we took through the Caribbean coast and through the accompaniment that Lutheran World Relief given our experience. The first recommendation is that we need to provide effective protection to the communities and leaders who are demanding their land. I don't think it's a surprise to any of you that these people need protection because they are constantly being threatened and murdered. Many more efforts need to be made to capture and punish those who are responsible for these aggressions. We need to have effective investigations, and we need to have exemplary sanctions against certain powerful people for this to work. Secondly, we need to provide sufficient guidance and information to local governments about how to implement the victim's law. Frequently, we heard that it was very difficult for communities and those who were trying to reclaim their lands, that the process was extremely difficult, and that it was hard to approach their local governments to try to get information and to start on the process of getting their application in for land restoration. The territorial zoning laws have also been very difficult to implement, and the land restitution will depend a lot on the implementation of these laws. Third, our recommendation is to improve legal assistance services for the victims who are hoping to have their land restored to them. The victims' law is part of a larger legal framework for displaced people. There's also the Justice and Peace Law and other laws. And the communities are saying that they really need more legal assistance to be able to have clarity about what they can claim and what processes they need to go through to claim them. The human rights organizations and the victims organizations need to provide more legal assistance, and the government needs to provide legal assistance as well. Fourth recommendation, considerably broaden efforts for titling lands for Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, including collective titling when appropriate, and titling for small farmers who have lived in their lands for many decades but who still do not have titles for those lands. Here it's very important to take into consideration the indigenous people of Sierra Nevada and Santa Marta and the Wayuu people. They need to have their sacred places and territories respected. There are places where they have been for a very long time. And we know that their territories are being threatened by large mining or agro-industry projects. The fifth recommendation is to monitor the restitution units and the restitution judges and the notaries of the transitional justice communities. Because there are some cases in which legal or semi-legal aspects have been used to dispossess small farmers of their land. Some leaders and local officials have expressed their concern to us about the need for monitoring and vigilance of the transitional justice committees. One official said to us in Sucre that the previous mayor had created his own victims organizations, and he chose the victims for the committee. A rancher, important, especially because we know that Colombia is a very unequal country where and small farmers need the land, and the country needs the land to be distributed more equitably so that there can be peace. We believe this is a very important step towards peace. And that was also expressed by the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations in her report, which I mentioned earlier. Before I finish, I'd also like to refer to the concerns that we have as international organizations and that the communities also have. And that is, what will restitution be like? What condition will the land be in when it is returned to them, and what land will be returned to them? And I'm referring to comprehensive reparation actions. How is the land unit going to protect the rights of the farmers in a situation where other people are on their lands? How are we going to make sure that these situations are resolved justly? For restitution, we understand that they are measures for reestablishing the situation before their rights were violated. However, they need to be able to begin their lives again, and for that they need many different kinds of support.
There were 53 families that were organized in a collective group. They had 600 cows in the project, and they were also producing dairy products. They were not poor campesinos, they were displaced, and they are still trying to go back to their land, but they're facing a great deal of difficulties. So we're wondering, what is it going to be done to help these farmers to recover their livelihoods, their former livelihoods? And then, what do we have to do in order to respect the indigenous people, people's relationship with their territory, and how it's not working. We have 5 recommendations. Can you hear me now? Sorry, my microphone was not working. So that they can plan their own campus, their own economies, and this is in order to make sure that they are communities that can contribute to the development of the region. In this case, I'm talking about the Caribbean region. Then sustainable development programs in order to ensure their self-sufficiency. For this, they will need technical assistance so that campesino families will have business plans to sell their products, so that they can also transform these products and be able to sell them. And they will need also financial support and credits to forgive the debt of campesino families, when the debt that they incurred in when they were displaced, then to invest in rural infrastructure such as roads, waterways, sewage, rural housing, and so on and so forth, and then to respect previous consultation with indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. The farmers were telling us that they didn't really want that much. They just wanted the government to fulfill their promises, the things that are included under the victims' law, and they don't want to see the same situation that they saw with the Justice and Peace law. They want to make sure that companies do not take away their lands illegally to grow palm or GMO corn. The agrarian counter-reform was really affecting the Caribbean region, so we have to take really all these points into account. Thank you.
Suarez.
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Contrary to the other presenters, I'm not an expert on lands, but I've worked a lot with victims, and I am here to let you know about what type of support USAID is providing to the victims law and the land restitution law. First of all, I would like to talk about the support that we provide to victims, which goes back to a program its objective is to support displaced population, and then the other program that started in 2009 that has to do more with land. At the end of my presentation, I will offer some general comments about the challenges that we've identified in the implementation of the law, and also the challenges that an eventual peace process would encounter. First of all, I would like to talk about the displacement peoples program that started in 2000. It lasted 12 years, and throughout these years we managed to help almost 1 million beneficiaries. The investment was $250 million. Our objective was to support the government in the provision of direct services to displaced people, services such as education, healthcare, income-generating activities, housing, and food security. The idea at the beginning was to try to get to those places. Well, we obviously had a learning curve, but the idea for us was to try to get to those places where the government was not getting for some reason. The program really included many areas, and it was very dispersed at the beginning. We managed to reach 600 municipalities but the impact on each of the beneficiaries was quite small given the magnitude of the problem. In 2006, thanks to a study or a survey conducted by the National University, we refocused our efforts and our coverage. We limited the program to 150 municipalities, and we tried to focus mainly on housing issues and income-generating activities as very important factors in the lives of our beneficiaries. We had less beneficiaries, but the impact was a little bit bigger. In 2010, MSI conducted an assessment, and their conclusions were that there were some successful cases, and that also they identify some big challenges and also changes. However, given the scope of the problem, our impact was being minimal. After that, we decided to focus on institutional strengthening. So we started working with key government agencies in order to implement the policies to provide services to displaced people, such as the Ministry of Interior or the University of Los Andes, with whom we worked on a project that had to do with the Constitutional Court, because we were following the guidelines that stemmed from the sentence T25. This program lasted till March 2012. At that time, we had a new legal framework, which was the Victims' Law and the Land Restitution Law. We designed a new follow-up program, and we decided to include all the victims of the armed conflict, not only the displaced people. And we also tried to respond to what we thought was one of the biggest challenges of the law, which is to transfer from a system where we assist the people to another system where we offer dignified treatment to the victims, but where we're focused on the reparation that the victim needs. In other words, there was a change in the strategy and in the way that the problem was addressed by the institutions included in the law. The institutions had really worked in a very different way up to date, and also the mentality of the public officers changed, which is a very difficult step to take. And that was in order to provide some comprehensive reparation and to also take into account the vulnerable situation of those people that had been displaced. The government's approach is in 10 years, and it included $27 million, an investment of $27 million. We had to think about a strategic way of investing our very limited resources so that we could obtain the greatest impact possible. We started a victims project that aimed to provide support to the key government agencies in order to develop the necessary tools to be able to implement the victims' law during the first stages of the law, the 3 first years, so that they can really do their job throughout the 10 years that the law will be in effect. So we are working with 3 main national entities: the Victims Unit, the Ministry of Health, and the Center of Historic Memory. This is a 3-year program, and eventually, with the tools that the national government is developing, we want to reach 21 municipalities in the country. And we would like to support the processes that the different municipalities have to go through. And we would like to also provide the government with lessons learned from this process so that they can implemented in other municipalities. This program has 4 different components. The first one has to do with strengthening, institutional strengthening. All this has to do with the roadmaps, strategic planning, coordinating mechanisms among the different national agencies and international agencies, also different actors at local levels, internal and external communications, and everything that has to do with the monitoring the implementation of the law. The second component entails coordinating with the Ministry of Health, and we are trying to strengthen the institutional capacity of this ministry so that they can provide mental and physical health services. It focuses on providing services to the displaced population. These issues are key in order to provide support to the victims throughout the process that they have to go through in order to transform their lives. The third component of the program has to do with transitional justice, and it has 2 subcomponents or sub-elements. The first one is the administrative reparation processes led by the victims unit, and the second one is everything that has to do with the task undertaken by the Center of Historic Patrimony, which has to do with the search for truth. The fourth element is related to the structures implemented by the national government and all those different mechanisms that are being used in order to help 4 groups: women, disabled people, LGBT population, and ethnic minorities. As I said, this is a program focused on institutional strengthening. However, there is a small component that has to do with direct services provided to the community, given this vacuum that exists and the need that we see in victims of sexual violence. So that's why we decided to provide this type of services. We have a pilot project that will start in May of this year in Chocó. With regards to the challenges of the peace process, there are many, but we are especially concerned about 3 of them. The first one is the following. The priorities with regards to public opinion and public interest has been focused on the demobilized population, and this is of great deal of concern. This is something that concerns us. The second is the disproportionate growth of the number or increase of the number of victims, which is really high right now, and also when we after the we saw that the victims still did not feel safe to claim their rights. Another element is that we need to make sure that the FARC gets involved in the process in order to seek truth, and so that we can have real reconciliation among the different parties involved. We don't have an answer for this, we don't have a solution, but we think that we could work with other parties in order to strengthen victims and victims' organizations so that they can monitor the implementation of the law and also demand from the government that the reparation part of the law is implemented the way it should be. The land aspect is something more recent. We've been doing this since 2009 through different programs. For example, the public policy program, we supported the law, all the aspects that have to do with the restitution of law or the restitution of lands, that unit that was led by Ricardo. And we've also provided technical assistance to key agencies in the process. For example, through the Afro-Colombian program, we are working with ethnic communities, and we're also working with the restitution unit, and we are supporting Alinco there in the definition of a strategy to identify collective territories. And then we have another program about access to justice. We've been training restitution judges so that they can really work in an effective manner. At this point, we are also in the bidding process for a new program that is focused on the land. It's a 5-year program, and will be start before the end of the year. Its budget will be between $55 and $65 million, and it has 4 components. The first one, support the government or strengthen the government's capability in order to restitute or return lands. The second is to strengthen the process, the titling process, especially in areas affected by conflict. The third element is to support national agencies and local governments so that they can work together with the private sector and also so that they can create sustainable opportunities of legal livelihoods for those that live in conflict-hit areas. And the fourth element, to strengthen the government as a whole so that they can monitor the restitution process and the land tenure process. And then in terms of the challenges of an eventual peace process, everyone mentioned the campesino reserve areas, the use of soil, the land registry, effective access to land, safety, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
I'm going to be very brief in my summary so that we have an opportunity for individuals who would like to ask questions to do so. And I just remind the audience that there are microphones on both sides, and if you could please line up and state your name so that the audience knows who you are before you ask your question. Thank you. Our 3 speakers present topics that are intimately integrated with each other. We have how to go about actually implementing and establishing the judicial basis for restoring lands, and the very interesting story of how you collect information. As a historian, I know that this is a long-time problem. So when you encounter deeds from the 19th century or even the mid-20th century, the way in which boundaries are marked are in the following fashion. From the farm that belonged to Piedrahita, that goes to the very large boulder that ends at the river, after you cross the bridge, and then you've gone through the cattle fields of so-and-so. And you go, what happens if the boulder dissolves, the river gets redirected because of erosion, and Piedrahita sells his land? And when you look at deeds, you realize to what degree there's a process of incorporating more and more land without it being formally such, so that each time someone goes and buys a piece of land, they simply stretch the boundaries because there's no surveyor or engineer who actually goes, it's costly, to formally address what the size of that territory is. So this is an enormous and historically very important problem for Colombia as a whole, and one that's never been addressed. It was one of the critical problems in actually implementing Law 200 under Alfonso López Pumarejo in 1936. It became a critical problem in the rehabilitation process after La Violencia and the efforts to have tribunals that would restore lands to peasants in conflict who had been displaced. And we see the effects of not having dealt in any of those eras with those particular problems in the contemporary period. So this is a very important topic, I think. One of the issues that I think is quite interesting and that I hope a little dialogue might emerge, perhaps in relation to the questions that are going to be asked, is how we move from restitution to protection to a very critical point that was raised in our first series of presenters, and that is the absence of institutional mechanisms for actually making real the integration, constant communication, and coordination between between community groups, grassroots groups, local government, the regional, and the national, and then in a larger sense, the international. I'm just going to leave that there as a kind of thought that we might think about in the discussion afterwards. So I will begin on the right, and if you could please introduce yourself.
I prefer speaking in Spanish.
Claro.
Mi nombre es Diego.
My name is Diego Cortés. I'm a researcher, specialist in international law, and I am very fortunate because I've been a witness of the Colombian conflict, but I also feel that I am a victim. I would like to ask a very specific question. Why is it that we're not talking about the post-conflict era, and everyone is talking about the restitution of land without having actually finished the justice and peace process. So my question is, has the government designed a policy in order to protect victims that have been displaced and that are claiming their lands back? Knowing that after a few years, the paramilitary that were imprisoned will be released. My second question, why in Colombia we're talking about land restitution without really knowing exactly how much land was stolen by the FARC? We are really addressing the conflict from one side, I think. And even though I think it is good that victims can claim their rights, I don't understand why we're not addressing the conflict from both sides.
The following three. Yes.
Gracias. Mi nombre es Lina Céspedes, estudiante.
Lina Céspedes, PhD student. I have a question for Ricardo. I actually have two. The first one, you talked about the success that was achieved, how your unit managed to be successful. However, I would like to hear the other side of the story. What happens with those campesinos that do not manage to have a clear case that could be brought to a judge? I'm saying this because before the case is taken to court, there is some administrative proceedings that are quite complex. And that is a barrier or an obstacle that I identified as a lawyer and that I believe is quite significant, the administrative proceeding. And that is not mentioned very often in the news or the panels. And I would like to know how many campesinos are left there at the door of the administrative proceeding. Another question as a lawyer, based on your experience with the land restitution unit, which ones do you think are the main steps to be taken so that we can have a land administration system that can ensure that certain situations are do not happen again? Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Pravash Valian. My unit is working also on land restitution and conflict resolution. I have a question for Salgado. I would like to know if the land restitution unit is promoting the participation of local entities, councils, associations, and so on and so forth. I would like to know if they're using GPS technology or other types of technology in order to ensure transparency and coordination with ENCODER as well as with your office. Thank you.
Questions and ask our panelists to answer those, and then we'll take the next set. Or do you want to take all of them? Okay, you're a glutton for punishment.
Okay, mi nombre es Cristina Espinel y soy del Colombia Human
Cristina Espinel from the Colombian Human Rights Committee here in Washington. My question is for Mr. Sabogal, and it has to do with the Pavas community. We support them, and we have invited community leaders here to come to the United States to talk about their community. We understand that there was a ruling in favor of the community so that they could recover their land. That happened quite a few months ago, and to date, the campesinos have not received their lands due to problems in the local government. For me, that is a contradiction. A national organization rules something, and a local entity doesn't abide by it or doesn't fulfill it. What can be done? In the Pavas community, we don't have plantain trees, we don't have other types of trees. There's a palm plantation, but the campesinos cannot provide for their families anymore because their land has been occupied by a palm plantation.
La verdad, me siento bastante cómodo para.
The truth is, I feel quite comfortable answering your questions because the government is doing a great deal of work with regards to all the issues that you mentioned. Let's start with the victims first. As soon as the law went into effect, we created a unit for those people that are reclaiming lands. Many of those people at this moment are being protected by the government. Obviously, the system is not perfect. There are flaws, but it's better than what we had before. Because before we didn't have such a thing. And we are doing this in a preventive manner. As soon as the land restitution land gets in contact with another unit and says, there is a person here that is being threatened, you have to protect him or her, that is implemented. And it's not only the victims are being protected, but also the government officials that work in the different territories. They also need to be protected because they're doing a great work. In terms of the land stolen by the FARC, someone said that we're not working on that, but yes, we are addressing that. The law, if you actually analyze the last two laws, 975, stopped, basically received information from the victimizers, and then the law, the victim's law, actually listens to the victim and based on their testimonial starts building up a file. So out of the 30,000 complaints, around 37% of them told us that the FARC forced them, or rather, the guerrillas forced them to leave their lands. And the restitution unit is bringing cases to the judges using the information provided by the victims. And this information said that they were forced out of their lands by the guerrillas. And we already have rulings and decisions by the court saying that those lands have to be returned to their communities. So the government, or my unit, is applying the law for all actors. Everyone that stole land has to return it, and this has been applied through the whole country. Our land restitution unit, our offices are located in the areas that were affected by the paramilitary, but also those affected by the guerrilla. Now or in the past, we are all over the country where people had to leave or were displaced because of the conflict.
There was also a question about how to put together the files. I'm not sure that I explained myself well the first time around. When I'm talking about the cases in which we have sufficient proof to be able to take them to a judge. And when we do take a file to a judge, in many of the cases we've found that the petitioner has told us lies. They might say, I had to abandon the land because of the conflict, and when we went back, we found out that the first wife was there with her children. And we will not take cases like that to the judge. We take them to the Attorney General's office for investigation in case people have obtained benefits fraudulently. But a lot of times we have inheritance conflicts that we're dealing with. Perhaps conflicts between siblings. Sometimes our businesses that peasant farmers or contract that peasant farmers made among themselves, but they didn't like the price, so they decided to bring it to the land restitution unit. We try not to deal with those cases. When someone has had to leave their lands because of the conflict, we do everything possible to take those cases before the judges and to use all of the powers of the state to do so. And we are doing that. Sometimes if cases don't go before the judge, it's because some of these things that I've mentioned are occurring, or because the land that they have abandoned is perhaps a national park, and the national parks cannot be made into private property, or perhaps because perhaps some of that land is within an indigenous reservation or within the territory of a black community, Afro-Colombian community. We don't take those cases to a judge unless we find that the right of the peasant farmer existed before the park was created or the ethnic community came to that land area. We might take those cases, but that their relationship to the land, if it happened after the park was formed or after the ethnic community had claim over the land, then we cannot take those cases to the judges, to the courts. There are great challenges, and you're mentioning some of them. What can we do to make sure that the government institutions that need to coordinate are doing so? This is an enormous challenge as well. There are a lot of institutions in the country that have to do with land, and to get all of them to agree on something is not easy. The committee that someone mentioned a while ago that is a space where we hope to bring together all of the institutions that are going to have to do with land restitution or with the judge's decisions. And we hope that that space will begin to improve communication among the groups. Now, we, as government organizations, always try to work with the mayors of a local area so that they can help in the process of restitution. Some of them listen to us, some of them listen to us and help us, and some of them don't listen to us at all. But the right to restitution is above what the local power may believe or want in this particular case. And so what we try to do is to support the process of the victim in these cases. I didn't speak very much about the period of time after the court decision, and that is important as well, because you want to make sure that the restitution doesn't just remain as a decision on paper. There's a great effort that the government is making so that the land that is being returned to the victims can have the opportunity to have dignified living conditions and productive projects on those land. And so we are trying to work with the local mayors in that case to improve roads, and we're trying to make sure that the conditions exist for people to be able to make a living in that area. And there are significant amounts of resources designated to do this, and we're doing that right now with the victims that have had decisions in their favor from the courts.
For the coffee break. So if you could limit yourself to one question, I would greatly appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Cindy Buell, and I work as a super strong supporter and admirer of what you're trying to do in the land restitution, in implementing the land restitution law, as well as the victims' rights law. And we want it to be as successful as possible. So thank you very much for your work. But when I look at Colombia, and you're looking at 4.5 to 5 million displaced, and at this point we're looking at 30,000 petitioners or cases, which is great to start. Even if we assume, let's say, half of the displaced are not going to return, that still leaves you with like 2 million to 2.5 million universe. And I guess I would be interested in hearing from you, what do you view seeing next? How do you view closing that gap? How are we looking at, or do you see 30,000 cases, maybe 100,000 cases, and 5 million eternally, forever displaced with a serious permanent underclass inside Colombia.
Okay.
Hi, my name is David Murillo Hadjibaiva. I'm coming from Congressman Mike Honda's office. I really want to ask two questions, so I'm going to make an exception here. The first one,
please integrate your
yeah,
question.
just really short, really short. The first one is on the Joint Action Plan for Ethnic Equality. I want to know what's the process on that, and how is that going for Ms. Alvarez? And also, Mr. Ricardo, I want to come for you too. Just the combat zone, I know that you mentioned that security is a key factor in determining whether individual cases move on. Now, people, for example, in the state of Chocó who are living in combat zones, are their cases being put on hold just because of where they reside? So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about combat zones and also ethnic communities such as the Afro-Colombians and the indigenous community. And just, I can see your face, you're kind of a little confused on what I was saying before. So the Joint Action Plan for Ethnic Inequality, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. I'm interested on the update on that and the status, and if that's playing any role in this land restitution process. I'm also intrigued by your answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es...
Good afternoon. My name is Evelyn Cordova. I come from Chocó in Colombia, and my question is for USAID and also for Mr. Sabogal. How is the accompaniment of INCODER being followed up in the process of titling lands for peasant farmers in processes that Afro-Colombian people have been working on in terms of the verification of the titling? We can say that this is very important in terms of the creation of conflicts because access to land and the level of informality that we live in Colombia is such that only INCODER can decide who owns the land that many peasant farmers are now occupying. And if you might know perhaps some of the studies of the titles of the communities, how is it possible to give proper follow-up to these cases so that INCODER can comply with the transparency and the titling of these lands?
I work for the State Department. My question is a follow-up to an earlier question regarding the national institutions working with local institutions to implement the victims' law and land restitution. You mentioned that there's still a lot of work to translate resources and the coordination at the local levels. But at this point in time, can you tell us a little bit more about if there is a comprehensive plan for protection, for tracking these cases, these land cases, for working with the personeros and the alcaldes that you mentioned are so critical at the local levels? And for the rest of the panelists, what have you heard throughout the country in Colombia at those local levels with the mayors and with the personeros, and what are some of their challenges at this particular time? Thank you.
I'm Jenny Bouvier from the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I'd just like to link the topic from this panel with the previous topic of the peace negotiations. I guess the first question is the question of restitution of lands being discussed at the table, and are there proposals coming from civil society about what should be discussed at the table, number one? And secondly, what about public opinion? We have a sense that at the peace negotiating table, there's a consensus that's emerged about the need for some sort of rural agrarian reform. To what extent does that extend, or is it seen as being conflated with the question of displacement and restitution of lands?
Thank you very much. Ricardo, you're in the hot seat.
In terms of the aid to the congressman, In terms of the numbers of people in the country, they say that there's a certain number of million displaced people. But I think it's possible in the last 20 years that all of these people left their lands. But however, not everybody are currently off their lands. Many of them have already returned. You may remember the country about 10 years ago. There was a huge population in the large cities that were not able to return to their lands. But now in large areas of the country, people have been able to go back. And in that sense, it's not that we have 5 million people really off their lands. But it's more of a situation of many people have not been able to go back, but many have. For example, in Bogota, in the capital, I think that is the city that has the most registered displaced people in the country. In Bogota, we have an office of our land restitution unit, and we have had 4,500 claims, almost 5,000 applications from Bogota. And Bogota, in some ways, provides conditions for people to do so freely. And we don't have huge crowds in our office. What I can say is that the people who lost their lands are coming, but there's a lot of people on our registries as displaced people who have been able to go back. And so we have to say that very clearly as well. In Monte de Maria, which Zoraida mentioned a while ago, that's an area where people have been able to go back to their lands. And so of the 200,000 or however many inhabitants that there are, many of them have been able to go back, a great majority. Or another very affected area of the country, which is the eastern Antioquia area, a lot of people have been able to go back there. But they continue to show up as displaced people in our statistics. So I think that statistic of 5 million displaced people, I think we have to look at it more closely. A lot of people have gone back, and they don't necessarily need to take advantage of the land restitution process. Those who haven't been able to go back because someone else is on their land, or because they are not able to actually make the trip, those people are coming to our office. And I think that's the difference between the large number of people registered as displaced people and the fact that we only have 30,000 cases that we're working on so far. Now, obviously, there's a lot left to do. There's a lot more people that need to come and to file their applications. But we don't believe that the dimension is of the magnitude of the millions and millions of people that are sometimes mentioned, because we know that many, many of them have been able to go back to their lands. In terms of the ethnic groups in the conflict areas, the government did a prior consultation with indigenous communities, and we agreed on the content of the reparations, and in terms of land restitution, we agreed how that was going to work in those communities. In the case of indigenous communities, the highest authorities that they have, that we have in the country, which is the Permanent Roundtable, where they tell the government 12 communities. And we found what many of you have mentioned. There's illegal mining, armed actors, and what we've been able to do is to use a very innovative process. We have some precautionary measures that allow the judges from our institution, instead of, before they make a decision on these cases, issue protection measures. So in some communities, the restitution court takes away mining licenses in a certain zone because they've realized that an ethnic community lives in that area and that mining concessions have been given, and so they take those concessions away. In other cases, they have suspended the decisions of other judges. In one black community in Nariño, the restitution judge ordered another judge to suspend the process that was advancing the work of an agro-industry there, because there was a conflict between the agro-industry and the private property claims of this ethnic group. And they could not move forward until we decided what the actual limits of that land and that property were. And so those kinds of things have happened in various areas of the country, and we have been documenting these cases. And so what do we do with requests for restitution where there currently is not, we do not have the security conditions to be able to move forward on the cases? Now, we do have some measures that allow us to protect certain lands, and what that means is that the land is sort of frozen in a way, and so no one can buy or sell those lands unless the legitimate owner does so. And so the judges also cannot make decisions on those properties until we are able to work on protecting those lands. And so what we're doing with those applications is that we're protecting those lands when the victims ask us to do so. And we wait until we have better conditions to be able to move forward with the actual restitution of the land. And in terms of the question about INCODER, what we do as a unit is normally, in the case of ethnic communities, they always have a leading role. They're the ones who decide on who owns the territory. In the case of the black community in Bajo Mira, the judge ordered INCODER to delimit the territory very clearly. And what we try to do is to work very closely with these institutions, and in those territories that you have described, we are trying to work very closely with them. Yes, perhaps I can answer very quickly. In terms of the Joint Action Plan for Afro-Colombians, that was a plan that was signed between the U.S. government and the Colombian government a few years ago to have a joint effort in terms of working with Afro-Colombian communities. And I can say that all of those efforts of USAID in Colombia to work with ethnic communities are within the framework of that general agreement. And what we're doing with institutional strengthening and what we're working on in Afro-Colombian communities do respond to those general guidelines that have come forth in that joint action plan. And I can certainly send you a detailed report about the compliance with that plan. So give me your information after the forum. And in terms of mechanisms for follow-up and evaluation on INCODER, this is precisely the support that of a plan that we're working on, and it's one of the 4 components that I was mentioning about the new program for land restitution and titling. So we are aware that this is an important tool that the government has to support.
Extraordinarily informative and willing to answer a great variety of very complex questions, and I invite you to take a coffee break and please return to the room in about 10 minutes so that we can initiate our final set of presentations. We have to be out of here by 5:30, so if we could keep to the audience. Thank you.
Our first speaker will be Dani Mertens. Dani, to my right, is currently an associate professor at Javeriana University in Bogota, and she is a researcher in the areas of gender, forced displacement, historical memory, and transitional justice. She has worked as a gender consultant and has worked at the United Nations High Commission on Refugees and UNIFEM, which is now UN Women in Colombia. Jaime Enrique Arias is a community educator and organizer from the Canquamo indigenous peoples and has worked for the promotion and protection of indigenous rights in Colombia. He is also a member of the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia and is currently Council Governor of the Canquamo people. Evelides Cordoba Borja is a community organizer for the Afro-Colombian communities in Choco and is the general coordinator for Cocomasur Community Council, and she has served as a mediator and consultant on land conflict projects. And finally, Luis Ernesto Vargas Silva is a magistrate of Colombia's Constitutional Court, to which he was appointed in 2009 and presides over the Special Division for the follow-up on Sentence T25, which is a historical ruling that requires the Colombian government to provide attention to internally displaced peoples. Dr. Vargas has a doctorate in law and social science from the Universidad Libre. And so we will begin with
I'm going to do this presentation in English because I was writing an article in English on my topic. My English is much slower than my Spanish, so I will do my best to finish in 10 minutes or 12. Transforming gender inequalities in land restitution. What are the issues? First, some preliminary statements. 1. Transforming unequal gender relations is an essential part of a democratization process. Therefore, it is not a secondary issue, but on the contrary, a crucial element of a peace agenda. In the land and rural development question, gender issues run from macroeconomics to the workings of family law and practices at the micro level. I'll focus especially on these micro-level processes and their importance for transformation of gender inequalities in the land restitution process, but also beyond in rural societies, and not only as transitional victims, not only women as transitional victims. 2, about the transformative potential of land restitution. As a part of a transitional justice process, land restitution should not only restore rights, but also guarantee their effective enjoyment. It is an opportunity for transforming historical inequalities exacerbated during conflict. So we should look at the realities in the field and ask us, does justice really include women? 3. Democratization of gender relations should be part of all rural development initiatives and enter discussions, for instance, of how the reservas campesinas should be organized and how men and women want to live in it. However, in this presentation, we focus on how, particularly, the land restitution process may lay foundations for and contribute to these transformations, and may contribute also to las zonas de reservas campesinas as models that consolidate gender-inclusive democratic exercises. So, what are the issues for gender and land? I will not talk about the enormous impact of big plantations, mining activities, and so on women's livelihoods. There are many issues when we talk about gender and rural development, but I will concentrate on 3 areas of concern. First, the historical underrepresentation of women in land ownership and the high degree of informality in land tenancy. This situation is emblematic for the position of women in rural society and their limited access to land and productive resources in their own right. And this is very important, in their own right. Women constitute only 36% of all formal landowners in general, and if you could look separately to peasant smallholders, the percentage would even be much lower. Women constitute only 11% of landholders in the few agrarian reform areas. This is due to the familistic we call it familistic public policy, that has privileged male-headed families and only exceptionally permitted the entrance of women as heads of households in agrarian projects, and only in some cases, and since the 90s, promoted the establishment of cooperative agrarian productive units for displaced women, mostly widows, under very harsh financial conditions. These women had to pay for the new land and did not receive proper technical assistance, and now they need their debts to be forgiven. This is an important point in general, the forgiving of debts. Whereas the lack of formal land title is a general problem for small landholders. According to the World Bank and UNDP, more than 40% of the landholders do not have a land deed. This problem is worse for peasant women. Indeed, the former land protection program, as Ricardo Sabogal also explained, reported 37% of women claimants in its database, but only 22% had been holders of a land deed. During the years 2011 and 2012, the Land Restitution Unit received claims by nearly 30,000 claimants, as was said before. 36% of them women. However, we do not know the characteristics of those women claimants. Are they heads of households, widows? Do they have partners? Are they organized? Do they receive protection? I will come back later to their cases. How are the legal obstacles sorted out in those cases? Second, the disproportional impact of the armed conflict and the special risks for displaced women. One of those risks is that of gender-based and particularly sexual violence, and the extreme levels of impunity associated with it. And also, this has been mentioned before, but it's especially true for women, the continued presence at the local level of actors, sometimes armed actors, or former armed actors, former perpetrators, who control people's, and particularly women's, moves and visits to government offices and to, for instance, prosecutors' offices. And also said before, the presence, or we can see this for the near future, no? The presence of former perpetrators who paid their sentences and will leave jail soon. In 2008, 50.8% of displaced women who answered a survey by the Ombudsman's office said they had been victims of sexual violence. In 2010, of the 190 cases of sexual violence in the context of armed conflict that had been presented 2 years earlier to the Constitutional Court, only 4 received a condemnatory sentence. That is 2%. Several studies show the connections between violent land seizures and sexual violence, the latter being a means to force a community into displacement and abandon their lands. There's a famous case, Chiwolo, now one of the pilot experiences of land restitution. Many testimonies of women victims refer to re-victimizations when they try to get access to justice. Threats, fear, and prejudice among civil servants hamper this access to justice. Third, these historical discriminations and the under-enforcement of gender equity laws for rural women that exist, and the disproportionate risk of violence make for particular sets of disadvantages that affect displaced women in return and restitution processes. For instance, a widow with an informal marital relationship and an informal possession of land, how is she going to be restituted in her rights? And more in general, how may access to landed property and productive resources in equal conditions for women and men be restored, or more accurately, be established? How can women effectively be protected when claiming, returning, and bringing the land into production? How can female participation be enhanced? Well, the Victims and Land Restitution Law offers some advances. although its implementation encounters multiple obstacles. First of all, there is protection, as Ricardo Sabogal explained. According to the new law, the Colombian state offers special guarantees and protection measures for all those who are exposed to special risks of violations of their human rights. And they recognize the special vulnerability of women. However, in practice, these measures don't work and are not gender sensitive. We will come back to this again. The sexual violence. It is also the sexual and gender-based violence in the context of armed conflicts is extensively referred to in the law, particularly with respect to the principles that should guide the collection of evidence according to international law. But we already have seen impunity. The impunity rate is nearly 100%. Prioritization of women in different bureaucratic contexts. Administrative and judicial procedures of land restitution, but as we shall see, still obstacles remain, particularly for women. And also joint titles. In all cases of restitution, the land deeds should be issued and registered as joint titles for spouses or permanent partners. But we also have the cases of those women whose husbands have been assassinated or disappeared, and then it's another story. The shift in the burden of proof. Women benefit from the fact that in judicial procedures against violent actors, the burden of proof is shifted from the victims, the weakest party, and often the women, to the perpetrators, the armed actors, and the other politically or economically mighty persons. However, to reach this point, to come to this point, presenting proofs is already a big challenge for women. And we see that there are lots of obstacles before reaching the offices of the government or of the prosecutors. So let's see the obstacles and challenges. I will focus on 3 areas. First, legal security for women. Informality of land tenure makes the collection of evidence for restitution of land to displaced women, particularly widows, very complex. Women need extrajudicial mechanisms, like, for instance, community testimonies, and not only, I think, technical mechanisms like Google Earth. And a very important part is the work history as a proof of possession. If women can use their long history of working the land without any titles, but working the land, this must be a possibility to prove their legal status of possessor of that land. And these procedures require also a legal treatment and a legal status in front of competing claims. A second area of legal security for women is the patriarchal marital practices, the male-biased policies, and the relation between transitional justice, like land restitution, and civil law. We have seen in practice that in many cases, family ruptures, successive marital relationships, simultaneous marital relationships amongst the displaced population and the returning populations are particularly problematic because they are not formalized and their relation to the land neither is formalized. Male victims may recover their patrimony after family rupture, but women become invisible because they are not considered rights bearers in practice to the broken family's land. And these are very concrete cases that have occurred, that a male victim may claim the land with a second family, and there is no proof of that the real victim of the real family members who are victimized are not there. Women are not always aware of their rights to the land, or they are not registered independently from their former husbands. Frequently, in the cases of murdered or disappeared partners, the man's relatives take the land and leave the widow and orphans without compensation. We have found these practices even in cases of collective land ownership of the indigenous peoples. Therefore, special attention has to be paid to what happens to widows and their children in the reassignment of land by traditional authorities in the indigenous justice systems. All these particular situations of factual or legal discrimination against peasant and indigenous women may be bundled into a package for a special technical commission in order to create anti-discriminatory solutions as part of the peace agenda. The second area is human security for women. In spite of protection measures by the central state, women remain vulnerable in local context of violence. Gender-sensitive protection mechanisms should be designed in a participative way and go beyond the strictly mechanical and, in a certain sense, military measures like vehicles, like cell phones, that doesn't work for women. And frequently, women are separated, women that need protection are separated from their children. Really, we have to think of how to design gender-sensitive protection measures. Will they be effective for women? And finally, there are two general points, I think. Participation mechanism of women and organizations in rural institutions and in consulting mechanisms should be made effective. And gender-sensitive information systems. This is also a theme that has been mentioned in the former panel. Women have their own rights, but public policy and even information systems, they are absolutely family-oriented, and they're oriented towards male-headed families. So always the women have like a second registration, a secondary registration status. So I think this is an important point for enhancing their rights and make more effective the restitution of their land rights for the future. So I will, yeah. I will take it.
Thank you. And next we will have Jaime Enrique Arias.
Good afternoon. The purpose of my talk here is to share some considerations that Colombian indigenous peoples have woven over the last many years around policies implemented by the government having to do with the armed conflict, and to share some conclusions that we have come to in terms of the peace negotiations that are happening right now in Havana, Cuba. First of all, I want to say that the indigenous peoples of Colombia are very pleased that the national government of Colombia has made efforts to generate a framework for reparation and land restitution to victims of the armed conflict. And we're also very happy that they have decided to enter into negotiations with the FARC to try to obtain a peace. However, we also have a very critical lens that obliges us to have an ongoing analysis of progress, setbacks, and obstacles that make it hard to have a democratic future for Colombia. The indigenous peoples, as social and political actors of Colombia, have an ongoing dialogue and debate among ourselves, also with other social and political sectors, and with the national government, with a view towards making contributions to this process and to keep this process of reparations and restitution from failing. Everyone knows that in the history of Colombia, we've had a number of failed attempts to reach peace and to provide comprehensive reparation for victims. For many reasons, this is because of the exclusion of some sectors of the nation. That's why right now, strengthening the role of the indigenous peoples is one of the pillars of our movement, especially one of the main points, both in the reparations policy and in the negotiations at Havana, should include the issue of land ownership in Colombia, including indigenous territories. This presentation is divided into two parts. In the first, I will share some conclusions that indigenous people have reached around the policy of comprehensive reparations to victims, and the other half will have to do with our position on negotiations happening in Havana. Our conclusion is that the government has serious difficulties at the institutional level, at the budgetary level, and at the level of coordination to be able to make sure that victims actually receive reparations and have their lands returned to them. We also believe that the end to hostilities is not in and of itself a political solution to the armed conflict. We think for that, we as indigenous people are called on to participate in building in the short, medium, and long term that sustainable and lasting peace. To begin, I'd like to explain that indigenous people enjoy a very specific policy for reparations, comprehensive assistance, protection, and restitution of territorial rights. And this is because the general policy on victims was not consulted with us ahead of time, and so as an action of solidarity with other victims in the country, we decided to request the Congress to give extraordinary powers to the President to be able to pass a particular law for our peoples. We are happy to say that the result of this exercise was able to have the active participation of indigenous peoples and the national government, and that we were able to have a law for intercultural dialogue. However, in spite of the fact that this is a good example of good practice for prior consultation, and in spite of the innovative measures that it contains for collective groups and giving reparations to collective groups, Decree 4633 has not been implemented. There are three main problems with this law that has kept it from being implemented. The first is that the institutionality created is very precarious. While there was a special institutionality established for the reparations to indigenous peoples, it's insufficient. There are very few officials, and they're not enough to satisfy the needs and the humanitarian assistance that many of our indigenous peoples need. So the humanitarian situation of indigenous peoples continues to be critical, and there's not sufficient response to the ongoing issues created by the armed conflict for indigenous peoples. And that's why we insist that genocide and the risk of physical extermination continues to be a reality. This problem has been referred to on many occasions, but it's not reflected in a solution to overcome this issue. Secondly, the budget that has been designated for indigenous peoples is insufficient. The proportion of the budget that we have been assigned is 0.72% of the overall budget for reparations, so less than 1% of the budget designated for implementing a policy for all of the ethnic groups in the country. The Constitutional Court in its has given some guidelines and has also indicated that we would need to have a greater budget to be able to meet the objectives of this law. The third problem is that we don't have sufficient coordination among officials at the central level and at the territorial level. In other words, officials don't know the law, they don't apply it, and they don't talk among themselves. So each official has his own idea of what reparations to the indigenous people should look like, and unfortunately they're not established in the law many times. And so this affects the viability of the policy for all victims. The main obstacle is the legal character. While there are some administrative measures to protect the territorial rights of indigenous peoples, a lot of those decisions fall on the judge. And that means that the legal process is not as swift as the victims would hope. In the indigenous case, there were 13 peoples that were supposed to be, or pueblos, that were supposed to be priority for describing damages to the land and for preparing the suits that would be presented to the judges. However, none of these have moved forward. In terms of the peace agenda, we feel like we are not represented in Havana either on the side of the FARC or the government. And that's why we have said that at that dialogue table, it's really not affecting our rights at all. And if there's going to be anything that affects our rights, it should be a process of prior consultation with the indigenous peoples. We're very concerned that things will happen without our consent as a result of these negotiations. Also, we want to talk about our vision of territory. For us, territory is not just something material. It has a spiritual element as well. And that's the basis of our life, of our history, of our law, of our government. It's the basis for our life. If we don't have territory, we don't have anything. So a negotiation that might affect our cultural principles would seriously affect our rights. Finally, we have some proposals that I will read generally because of the time, but we have worked on it in a joint indigenous meeting last year. We worked on these proposals, and this week, once again, there will be another meeting to visualize our recommendations as part of the peace process. We're very concerned that in spite of the fact that the Constitutional Court has issued some judgments, these have not been implemented. The government can say that there's a lot of laws in favor of indigenous peoples, but between what is said and what is done, there is a huge gap. So here's a series of proposals related to a number of aspects. The first is rural development and agrarian reform. We are working on a proposal to develop a multi-ethnic, multicultural community where we can talk as equals, not where the dominant culture runs over the minority culture. We have a proposal for true political and democratic participation in the country. We have another proposal on truth, justice, reparations, and a guarantee for non-repetition. And we are asking the Colombian state to recognize civil society as a fundamental actor for peace. We're asking for guarantees for a truth commission at the national level, a guarantee for collective reparations and individual reparations to victims. We've said that the FARC and the ELN are not our spokespeople, and they cannot negotiate our rights at the negotiating table. In terms of our autonomy, we're also proposing dialogue. But since government hasn't been able to guarantee peace in our territories, as you've seen in Cauca and Nariño and other places of the country, we are demanding participation in the peace process. And we're also asking for a national commission to accompany the process so that we can move from good intentions to concrete actions, taking into account the preponderant role of the United States in Colombia, and to make sure that there is a more serious commitment, not just for human rights, but also for peace by resolving the roots of the conflict. Thank you very much.
First two speakers, and I'd like to thank all my panelists for keeping to the 10 to 15 minutes. I know it's difficult. There's so much to say, and we're all so interested. So our final two speakers will go. We will start with Everildis. Thank you.
Everildis.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity as Cocomasur to participate in this conference. There's such a little amount of time to tell you what's happening and what people are experiencing. I'm not going to be able to do this in 10 minutes, but what I tell you is going to be very important to give you an idea of how there's another way of seeing this conflict. Everyone thinks that from the negotiation table and from state public policies are going to come this resolution of the conflict. But in the work that we have done in the communities, we have had to look for solutions for our own problems and our own conflicts. So sometimes we want the negotiating tables to come to agreements and for the state to come up with public policies that will be the exact route to be able to reach peace. But we don't do what we need to do as citizens as part of this conflict. We do know that we all have responsibilities, and each one of us can contribute to this process. In this sense, I am going to be brief, telling you that in the Black community of the South, in Cocomasur, we have been working on the peaceful resolution of conflicts relating to land since 2010. And we have started doing this because of an experience that was very difficult for us. We lodged complaints in various agencies at a moment that was very critical for us because we were trying to use forest resources in our development, and we were attacked by neighboring landowners who wanted to keep us out of those lands, and our legal representatives and other members of our group were threatened so that we wouldn't continue. We placed complaints, we looked for help, and we realized that by the time help comes, we could be dead or the worst things could happen in a community. So we realized that those who have to develop strategies are ourselves, and that those strategies are extremely important, that they can be an example for others to follow, and that organizations may be able to help us in our strategies. But it has to come from the initiative of the human beings in the communities that are being affected. And so we need to say we are going to look for the solutions for our problems. So when there's a will to do that, I think we can find solutions. Given that situation, we found on the path Mercy Corps, who helped us with some conflict resolution work on land issues. I personally am a displaced person from Decandé, but I returned at that time, and I kept doing what I had always done, working with the communities, and to try to see what opportunities we had in our place, because when we went to the cities to live, when we were forced to live there, and we didn't find the solutions to our needs, and such difficult needs that we had when we were displaced, we had to try to go back. And so to go back, we had to have strategies. Land has a value for each person and a meaning for each person. For large investors and for landowners, it's money. For those of us who live from the land, it means food, it means survival, it's life. And so we each defend land depending on the meaning that we give to it. So what can we do so that in this land that we all want, regardless of what kind of meaning we ascribe to it, how can we make sure we can live and live in peace? And I think that we can with strategies for development where we dialogue and we respect each other's rights. However, this cannot happen in the midst of public policy and dialogue such as those happening in Havana. It has to happen through dialogue in our localities. We have to talk about dialogue with our neighbors, dialogue with each one of the people that live on the land. And we have made progress in this respect. What we have been able to achieve is to have a peaceful resolution to intra-community problems with the support of Mercy Corps and with another organization that's helping us with gender issues. And we have made a great deal of progress. Women have been able to build strategies, from our daily lives, recovering our cultural identity and including our children and our young people in this process. And all of these activities that we have been involved in have yielded results. Today, we cannot say that we have resolved all the conflicts that we have, but at least we have been able to contribute to our community so that people can understand that we are united and that they can't attack us individually, because we have reached consensus on the concept of the collective. And so the conflicts are resolved within our organization collectively. So I want to end by saying that I would like to invite the Colombian state through land restitution programs to begin a real restitution process where the communities are involved, where they begin to ask about the history of the land from the people who are living on the land. We are the ones who can say what has happened and what is occurring in each community. We also want to ask the Colombian state to apply the necessary sanctions to guarantee legal certainty in terms of the titling of the land. We know that ancestral lands, not just for indigenous people and Afro-Colombian people, but also other small farmers who have lived in these lands for generations and generations, that this ancestral connection to the land is extremely important. And so I think we can reach alliances in various territories that will allow us to make progress on resolving land conflicts. I want to invite the international community to be part of this process, because we can't describe the characteristics of a particular land and to do all the work necessary if we don't have the resources necessary to do that. We want to thank those of you who have helped us so far, and we want to remind you that women have an extremely important role in terms of our connection to the land, because we know that land has a value that goes beyond money, and people own that and they defend that. And we defend that as women. So that's what I want to say today. And in these 12 minutes, I was not able to tell you all about Coco Masur, but you can find us on our website or on the Mercy Corps website as well. And you can learn about our peaceful resolution to conflicts there.
Vargas Silva, gracias.
Gracias a los organizadores por la invitación.
Thank you to the organizers for the invitation, especially to Lisa Hoggard from the Latin American Working Group, who has asked me to talk about the issue that was assigned to me here. I think we have so little time. I won't be able to give you the entire presentation, but you'll be able to read it later, and you'll see two essential emphases. What obligations does the Colombian government acquire in terms of minority groups when it comes to the restitution of land in the peace and with respect to the peace process? And so there are two main themes: the restitution of lands and the peace process. I hope that every time we speak about peace, we can always think about this place that is so full of light and so full of peace here. In the presentations I've heard here, I was remembering the rural development statute that we worked on in the courts. There were millions of hectares of land that we had to recover, and so many public lands and vacant lands that we had to deal with. So what was the statute of rural development? It was, in my judgment, the way to implement the justice and peace law. This statute of rural development, if it had been applied, would have meant that Ricardo Sabogal would not have had to talk at all, because all of these land issues would have been resolved in another way. When we began our work in the court,
el proyecto casi agonizante. Me dijo, esto está perdido. Tenemos 7 votos. De los 7 magistrados, 4 están en contra del proyecto que yo tengo, 3 están en favor. De manera que te entrego una causa casi perdida. Mira a ver qué haces tú con este cadáver insepulto. El cambio que se hizo en esos 16 días de febril trabajo con relación al tema.
Throughout those 16 days, there was a big change. We wanted to talk to the present to the court our case, and said that those articles were not constitutional. They were going to cause a lot of problems in terms of the indigenous people and the Afro-descendant people. The whole statute had to be taken into account because it was a comprehensive code that regulated everything regarding rural development, as in the way that it was conceived by Minister Arias. He worked on this for many months. Finally, the court, on the 18th of March, ruled the sentence C-175, issued the sentence C-175, and it was 5 against 4 with regards to the proposal. The court approved the whole statute of rural development, and thanks to this decision by the Constitutional Court, we can talk about the restitution of lands and also about victims. I became a champion of previous consultation with the indigenous communities and Afro-descendants. They actually call me a previous consultation. They call me that. They say, here, there it goes, previous consultation, because every time the court has to rule about decrees, laws, or amendments to the Constitution, they have to take into account the previous consultation process, because I believe it's the most important mechanisms to defend the interests and rights of collective groups that have been neglected in the past. So, in my presentation, you will hear about how we see the conflict and how we see the need to take protection measures in favor of these minority groups that are the most affected ones by the displacement process. The percentage of displaced people. The highest percentage of displaced people is the Afro-Colombian population, and then we have the indigenous people. Both communities are at permanent high risk because unfortunately they are targets of the different parties in conflict. So you will see you will hear during my presentation many rulings by the Constitutional Court. Given this decision, the Constitutional Court actually tasked us with the execution of the structural sentence T025. That's why most of the decisions mentioned there, since they have to do with this, are backed by us. We've worked on it, and at the end of the 8 years, the office under my responsibility is the one that will issue more sentences in this regard. So, first issue, the importance of titling and fundamental rights of the communities, both indigenous and Afro-descendants. We, taking into account the jurisprudence of the courts, decided that indigenous and Afro-descendant communities have to receive special treatment in the peace process. First, they have fundamental humanitarian rights. Their rights differ from the individual rights of each of the groups. And third, those rights are not the same rights as other rights of other social groups. Hence, the importance of rights and the legal arguments to support these rights using international instruments as well as national Colombian legislation. And we underscore the need to give special protection to these communities. Second, we analyze the reasons, constitutional and legal reasons, why these communities are vulnerable individuals and therefore deserve special protection. There are different factors. We analyze historic factors, social factors, political factors, as well as legal factors. They're all developed in our study in order to explain why these communities deserve special treatment. And hopefully we'll understand the historic debt that we have with them. And then we analyze the constitutional recognition of the ethnic pluralism included in the political constitution. After talking about the need of these ethnic groups, we talk about peace, and we develop or explain the problem that we're facing or that we will face when we bring the peace process at a constitutional level. Our president continuously says that the protagonist in this peace process will be the Constitutional Court. Well, of course, the Constitutional Court in a few days, in a few weeks actually, will have to analyze the legal framework for the peace process, and the Constitutional Court will have to analyze all the different legal instruments and legislative acts in order to decide whether everything decided and conciliated during the peace process that becomes a law follows or not the constitutional provisions. There is special reference in sentence C-370. This ruling or decision was very important in order to implement the lay justice and peace. In this ruling, the Constitutional Court said that if peace was whether peace was a subjective right or a legal obligation. if it was a collective right or a national goal, or if it was a collective purpose of international nature. So the presentation develops each of those 5 topics and concludes that peace is a collective right of international nature. But in this ruling about peace, we found a situation that really called our attention with regards to an issue that we'll address later on. When we had tried to achieve peace following the terms of the government, the Constitutional Court decided that the guarantee of justice, understood in general terms, in other words, as the rights of victims to have access to justice, reparation, and truth, the court demands flexibility in its application and implementation. In this context, we understood that the need to have political reconciliation agreements with the different social groups demands certain flexibility when applying the principles that regulate the judiciary. The court also decided that putting down the arms and the demobilization of armed groups were mechanisms that would help consolidate long-lasting peace. And if the court saw the need in transitional justice or permanent justice to increase flexibility in the rights of the victims, and that most of the claims have to do with justice, peace, and reparation, we will encounter a big problem. We will encounter a big problem with regards to the rights of these minority groups, indigenous communities, Afro-Colombians, with regards to this increase in the inflexibility. To what extent we can be more flexible, that has to be decided by the court when they undertake the task of regulating the peace process. When addressing the issue of access of victims to justice, peace, and reparation, they have to understand everything in this regard. Total satisfaction and comprehensive satisfaction of these rights could encourage armed groups to sign peace agreements. They need to understand what they are choosing, the costs that they would incur in order to satisfy the rights of the victims. And hence, in the ruling C-370 says that transitional justice has to address the social objectives of transitioning towards peace, and also promoting democracy, making sure that the victims' rights are respected and adequate reparation is given. All this has to be analyzed case by case, always taking into account minimum standards in terms of justice, truth, and reparation. These standards have to always be respected, and they were established very clearly by the same ruling. In these situations, under certain restrictions, certain amnesties, or forgiveness of certain things are accepted. However, measures that prevent victims from accessing or have access to justice in order to claim their rights won't be taken into account.
Las reflexiones esbozadas
we concluded the following. In those contexts where peace was the goal and the guarantee to access right, justice, and reparation was more flexible, there was an evaluation of minimum standards in terms of reparation, and it should take into account a differential approach. these communities always need to receive special treatment vis-a-vis other victims. It's not the same thing to take necessary measures to protect indigenous people or Afro-descendants. That's two different things. Why? Because of ethnic minorities and collective lands. The biggest issue here will be the restitution of collective properties and land that belong to these communities. These communities have been victims of human rights, and we have to take into account a new dimension of justice to promote respect of their identity. And these lands are necessary for their cultural and physical survival. And hence the issue, indigenous communities are at risk, not only at risk of disappearing physically, but also culturally. And that would be a violation of the agreement 169.
I'd like to thank our panelists again for their brevity and with such interesting presentations. And I just wanted to take one moment. I know that Ginny needs to wrap up, and perhaps questions as well. But one of the things that I've seen as a common thread running first through the first set of panels, then through the second, and then finally, is this underpinning of the need for the clarification, recognition, and enforcement of the continuum of land rights. In the first panel, we heard about private property rights versus customary. And then in the second panel, more about indigenous land rights, collective titling, common property. And then in this final presentation, about family law, inheritance, marriage law, the rights of even orphans, land tenure and property rights regarding orphans. And so the question that I'm walking away with is that this enforcement of the continuum of land rights, that it's not just about private property. And what I'll be thinking about on the plane ride home is how this links up to not only agrarian transformation, but the transformation of the conflict. And then the second point I wanted to make was that even with a sound framework, beautiful law, well-created, well-formed law, that there are then spatial dimensions and temporal dimensions to the implementation of that law that really requires engagement at all levels across space and time to make the implementation work. And I think I'm left with just how complex that process is. So, and then finally, what I saw through all the presentations was the importance of monitoring, not only for effective programming and implementation of the law, but to promote fairness and transparency. That it's not just about informed consent, which has been the practice of many development organizations, but prior consent, participatory consultation, and that consultation is and participation is meaningful and not just on paper. So those were just the comments I had to try to tie together. I could have had a whole other day with this. So, Ginny, I don't know if you want to do questions or just wrap up. Okay. Okay. Sure, so we'll go.
Mi nombre es Carolina Lev.
My name is Carolina Lev. I have a question. the constitutional law and the Colombian constitution and the Colombian law, I believe, is very rich, but sometimes the people don't really understand them. So from the court, how do you think we can make sure that that law is understood by the communities and reaches people at all levels, civil society organization, victims, and so on and so forth? What can the court do so that the society as a whole can understand the law, so that that law doesn't stay only in the higher levels, but also is applied in the daily lives of people? What law are you talking about? Well, the land restitution law specifically. Jimena Sanchez. I'm from WOLA, the Office of Latin American Issues in Washington, D.C. First of all, I would like to thank the judge here that talked to here and defended prior consultation. When you mention the more flexibility with regards to transitional justice and the rights of victims, my question would be the following. The government already undertook some responsibilities after the TO25 ruling. Will there be more flexibility in this regard too, so that we reach peace? I don't know if there was also, if there was any prior consultation with the Afro-descendant communities, and then there was a decree that was issued where the indigenous people were consulted, but not Afro-Colombians. So what is going to happen with that? What is the law that you're talking about? I'm talking about the land restitution and victims law. There was a prior consultation process with indigenous communities, but not with Afro-descendants. They were not engaged in this process. And my final question. In terms of jurisprudence and other are free trade agreements not the biggest obstacle for this?
From Uganda, I came to this discussion because of my interest in land and how the situation in Colombia is closely related to the situation in my country, which is emerging from conflict. And how the land issues in my country is also causing lots of trouble. But the country is dealing with it. But I wanted to really listen and see what I can pick from here to go and help me and also advise my country on how to get along with our situation. However, I've got lots of learning, and I want to thank the panelists for handling their papers very, very well. One issue that comes to my mind right now is that I've been hearing about fair and preferential treatment to disadvantaged groups in Colombia, especially by the courts. But I would like to know whether some of those treatment for the indigenous or the marginalized people, rather, are enshrined within the constitutional provision and in the legal regime within Colombia. Because it's one thing for the court to handle the justice issue, but there's another thing for the law to be applied differently. In Uganda, for instance, our constitution puts it very clearly that the people are supreme. It is very important for the legal regime in a country to recognize where the country is coming from. The historical background of the country is very important in the designing of the legal regime of a country. The Constitution of Uganda, as made in 1995, based on the history of Uganda. Uganda had gone through lots of conflict, lots of wars, lots of different kinds of changes of government. And now we are looking at how we can move forward as a country. And we said it's not going to be the government that is supreme. It's not going to be the people, the law that is supreme. it is the people who are supreme. That is one thing. And then when it comes to the law that govern the land and that govern property rights in the country, recognize also the diversity in our country, the different categories of people in our country. We have different ethnic groups. We have different regions that applies land ownership differently, especially based on the way the British governed our country during the colonial period. So the post-colonial period had its own challenges in the way we would handle our property rights. And the different government, like the Idi Amin's government, brought in also different ways and laws of governing land. Now, in the new constitution of 1995, we decided that we are going to give land tenure systems that fits every category of people in the country. Land ownership by registration would cover everybody who would want to register land, including the majority in the South. In the North, where I come from, we are basically owning our land using customary land tenure system. The customary land tenure system actually is basically ownership of land by communal system. The land is not registered. The land boundaries are remembered by the kind of physical features that were being discussed during these sessions. And it's quite complicated, but it will not be forgotten because land is owned and transferred from generation to generation. So a child will know that our family digs the land and it stops there. I would like to wrap up by saying that this kind of situation is very similar to the situation in Colombia, as you have been discussing. Are there these kind of differences in the application of laws, especially laws that govern land ownership, that would actually make the other groups of people that feel disadvantaged also feel comfortable and really enjoy holding land in the ways that befits their tradition, their heritage, their customs? And I'm really delighted to hear when my sister says that to an investor, land means money. But to an indigenous person, land means cultural heritage, means livelihood, means so many things. And all these kind of interests need to be enshrined within the legal regime of a country. I want to know how the legal structure and the constitution of Colombia takes care of the diversity in your country. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to have to turn it over to Ginny right now. Okay.
Well, first, congratulations to the panel for a wonderful array of ideas, and to all of you who have stayed through the bitter end here, and to our webcast audience who may still be tuned in. I just want to mention a couple of things. You know, I think we can all agree that the land issue is a very complicated issue, and the peace negotiations are even more complicated for their own set of reasons. But I think one of the things that becomes clear from listening to today is that these are long-term processes, and we need to think about them as long-term process. A peace accord is signed in Havana or wherever it's signed is not going to mean that peace comes to Colombia overnight. There are an array of issues and problems that will need to be dealt with. And I think that traditionally, the international community has celebrated when a peace accord is signed, and then they move on to the next item on their agenda list to, you know, send money there or to give their time to other priorities. And I think one of the things that's clear is that it's really important that the international community continue to accompany this process. I think the challenges ahead are quite daunting, and I hope that we're not left feeling too dismayed by them, because I think the civil society groups, I'll go to something that Everlidis said, you know, people are used to taking responsibility for their own issues at the community level, and I think that Colombia has tremendous capacity across the country to resolve the issues that face them. A little bit of help is always helpful, and I think having an accord that ends the conflict will be a first step to enabling the people of Colombia to address some of these issues. We've listened to some of the range of legal, cultural, political, administrative, judicial, institutional challenges that are ahead. We've talked only tangentially about some of the real blockages that are out there, thinking about the people who have tremendous vested interest in the status quo. And that maybe is an issue for another conference, because I don't think we can begin to address that. But those are real challenges ahead. One of the other things that I've heard is the call for dialogue. And I think in the same way that the challenges are long-term and go beyond the peace process, the need for engagement goes beyond the people who are at the table in Havana. Social transformation requires the whole of society to be engaged. And I think the calls for dialogue are really important. Hopefully that today's event has managed to begin a dialogue, at least in the international community, but one that I hope has its echoes and its spaces within Colombia. We will continue to try to offer spaces where these conversations can take place and continue. Some of the issues that have come up having to do with civil society, I think, haven't been fully fleshed out and merit a lot more discussion. In particular, how, for example, the UNDP was engaged with a process that was headed by the Colombian Congress, the Commissions of Peace, to gather inputs from around the country, from civil society, that would be brought to the table in Cuba. And I think it would be very interesting to explore, and maybe Absalón Machado can, in another intervention, can talk to us about what some of those interventions from civil society have said, how they're being integrated into the discussions at the table, if they're being integrated into the discussions at the table, and how they might differ. I think we've also heard from a number of speakers today how civil society, and particular sectors within civil society, are seeking autonomy. They don't feel represented by the table. I think this has been an issue from the start, that civil society is not at the table. So how do you translate the needs and the experiences and the expertise that civil society has to the people who are making decisions about how to end the conflict? And I think some of the answer came, I don't remember if it was Carlos who said, some of the answer comes that the table isn't going to decide everything. The table will decide to end the war, but there are many issues that will need to be resolved beyond that, that will require the engagement of many people beyond those that happen to be in Havana today. So with that, I'll close. There are many more things I could say. There are many more questions maybe than answers, but I really thank you all for being here, and I hope the conversation can continue. We do have many of the speakers have prepared papers, and we will be posting them, maybe not immediately, but fairly soon, on the websites of the two organizing organizations, both the U.S. Office on Colombia and U.S. Institute of Peace. So on behalf of U.S. Office on Colombia and USIP, thank you again for being here. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. You did a fabulous job. And the moderators, I feel less concern of not being able to give kind of a thorough summary, because I think that the panelists or the moderators managed during the presentations to help summarize along the way. So thank you very much for that, and to all of you.